Hi, and welcome to episode 7 of the Western Canon Podcast. I'm your host, Jordan Alexander Hill, and today we'll be talking about Euripides and his great tragedy, the Medea. Hello again, and thanks for joining me for episode 7 of the Western Canon Podcast. In this episode, we're going to be taking a look at the great tragedy Medea by Euripides. We'll also talk to the prolific Euripides translator Diane Arnson Svarlien, and in this episode, I'm going to introduce 2 new segments that we'll do each week here at the Western Canon Podcast for the edification and enjoyment of our listeners, whom we very much appreciate. So now for the Medea. Medea is actually the name of the title character of this play that we're going to be talking about by Euripides, which tells of the myth of Jason and Medea, more particularly Medea's revenge against Jason for betraying her with another woman. The Medea is now regarded as Euripides' best work, and it's now easily his most popular work, in part because I think the play really has all of the features: violence, murder, madness, love, betrayal, a powerful female character, which speak to our entertainment sensibilities today. But I also think that the play has become quite popular because it has come to be regarded as something of a proto-feminist tale, which is, I think, a bit simplistic, although I can certainly understand why scholars would make that assessment. In this episode, we're going to get into a bit of the mythic background of Medea. We need to understand this before proceeding to the story, and then I'll do a general summary and analysis of the play. And I want to say here at the outset that I'm using the Rachel Kitzinger translation of Medea for a couple of reasons. One, I really like it a lot. It's very clear and accessible. And two, Harold Bloom recommended it, saying that it is possessed of a, quote, freshness and pungency that should, quote, last a long time. And I certainly agree with that. The Rachel Kitzinger translation is part of a larger anthology, so you should check that out if you want to follow along. But first, let's take a look at the mythical context of this story, the background of this play, and that will give us a sense of how Euripides uses these myths to develop his own tragic drama. Medea, the title character of this play, is a princess of Colchis. Colchis is a town situated on the Black Sea, to which the hero Jason has sailed via his legendary ship, the Argo, with his sailors, the Argonauts, in search of the Golden Fleece. Now, Medea is the daughter of King Aegeus of Colchis, which is actually part of modern Armenia, if you wanted to locate it on a map. And Medea is, therefore, in a position to help Jason get the fleece when he arrives at her town. Jason originally goes on this quest because his horrible, usurping uncle Peleus has sent him on the assumption that the quest to get this golden fleece would be impossible, and therefore Jason would never return. So, in this way, Peleus could be sure that he would be able to get rid of Jason so that his usurpation of the throne that by right should have been Jason's, would be secure and successful. So Uncle Peleus is sending Jason on a quest that he knows Jason will never return from so that he can usurp Jason's rightful throne. And Peleus is right in the sense that Jason's pursuit of the Golden Fleece would definitely have been impossible were it not for Medea's assistance. This is because Medea's father, Aegeus, who again is king of Colchis, Aegeus has no intention of letting Jason have this storied fleece. He's like, this ain't happening. So Aegeus sets Jason with what he believes to be several impossible tasks to fulfill, which, if Jason can somehow absurdly complete these tasks, he can then have the Golden Fleece. These tasks include the order that Jason yoke together 2 fire-breathing, bronze-hooved bulls and use these bulls to plow a field. Jason then has to sow this plowed field with the teeth from a dragon that Aegeus supplies. And lastly, when these dragons' teeth spring up in the form of armed men who will rise up against Jason on all sides, surrounding him, he then has to fight these warriors and kill them. If Jason is able to do all of this, King Aegeus says, he can then have the Golden Fleece. Now, when Jason arrives in Colchis, Medea, who is actually a sorceress with powerful magical abilities, she falls head over heels in love with Jason. And so Medea actually helps Jason and makes it possible for him to perform the tasks that her father has presented him with, hoping, knowing, being quite sure of the fact that Jason will not be able to accomplish these tasks. Medea helps Jason using her magical abilities to actually accomplish these tasks. For example, she gives Jason a magic ointment to protect him from injury. This ointment is designed to prevent Jason from getting hurt so he can't be harmed while he's completing the aforementioned absurd tasks. She also helps him get the Golden Fleece by putting to sleep with magic potions the dragon that guarded the tree on which the Golden Fleece that Jason is trying to get hangs. For his help, in turn, Jason agrees to an arrangement. Jason says that when I get the Golden Fleece, I will agree to marry you and take you as my wife. And this makes sense. Obviously, once Medea has betrayed her father, secretly helping Jason to steal the fleece from him, she can't very well stay in Colchis. So Jason agrees to Medea's help on the terms that he'll marry her and take her with him back to Greece. And so once Jason successfully gets the fleece, the two of them flee together on the ship, once again called the Argo. Now, it's important to note here that Aegeus is not going to let these two outlaws get away so easily. Aegeus, Medea's father, decides to pursue the Argo in his own ship as they make their way, as they go to escape. But here, Medea actually helps Jason out once again. Medea finds an ingenious way to slow down her father's pursuit of the Argo so that they can make their escape. What Medea does is she actually kills her younger brother, Absyrtus, not only to prevent him from chasing them as they make their escape, but in order to slow down Aegeus' ship. You see, as Aegeus' ship catches up to the Argo in the chase, Medea, after killing her brother, cuts up his dead body into small pieces and throws the pieces overboard one by one. Now this works. I know this is gross, but this works to slow down Aegeus because Aegeus has to stop over and over again to collect each of the pieces of his son's body so that he can bury his son's body, his son's whole body intact, in order to give him, a proper funeral, a proper burial. Obviously, this tactic works to slow Aegeus down, and Medea and Jason are actually able to get away, to escape. So she kills her own brother so that she can hatch a plot to escape, and this plan actually works. But now Medea is a murderer. Now I want to stop here to address something that I think is important to fully understanding this play, and to getting a rounder sense of Medea's character moving forward as we're taking a look at the context and the mythical background of this play. From here on out, given what Medea has done, she is absolutely, completely cut off from her family, from her home, from her society, because she has betrayed her father and her community. She has fled, and she has killed her younger brother, which destroys her family's future and rules out any possibility of making amends. This means that Medea has cut herself off from her family, and from here on out, she is entirely dependent upon Jason, to a degree that would have even been unusual for a woman in ancient Greece. Because of her actions, this causes Medea to rely entirely on Jason, and thus she has little to no recourse if anything should happen, if Jason should maltreat her, right? She is completely dependent upon him. And this sets Medea apart from other women of her time. For example, in 5th century Athens, even though what you have is really a patriarchal society, the structure of the family in Athenian culture would have had some safeguards for a wife. Wives were not utterly and completely dependent on the goodwill, on the characters, on the good faith of their husbands to the extent that Medea now is. For example, a 5th century Athenian wife could appeal to her male relatives, to her father, to her brother, to her uncle. Any of these people could intervene on her behalf if she were being maltreated by her spouse. This is not the case for Medea. Secondly, although this was only an option in extreme circumstances, if a woman desperately needed to get a divorce in the case of some horrible circumstance, she could, even back then, but her male family members would have had to initiate this. All of this is out of the question for Medea, who has betrayed her family and is now completely and entirely dependent upon Jason. She's given up everything for Jason, and now all of her chips are resting on this new hand. And I really just want to emphasize this sacrifice that she's making, because it becomes a pivotal element in Medea in the play. Another thing to mention here, to get a sense of Medea's situation and to get a sense of the values of ancient Greece, is the fact that if 5th century Athens is any guide, an Athenian man could not marry a foreigner. This was a law. So Medea, at least by 5th century Athenian terms, cannot under any circumstances be Jason's wife. Marrying a foreign woman is taboo. In 5th century Athens, a man could not have more than one wife. So the only way a man in 5th century Athens could be with a foreign woman is if she were his concubine. And that, in 5th century Athens, was perfectly acceptable. You could have a wife and a concubine. Now, none of this is mentioned anywhere in the play. Nobody puts her dilemma in these terms. And of course, Jason was not living in Athens. But I bring all of this up because this was the law in Athens when Euripides was putting on this play. And this is what the Athenian audience would have understood as they were watching Euripides' play. In the mind of an Athenian audience member, Medea would have been viewed likely as Jason's concubine and as someone who could not legally be his wife. Okay, so remember that the theft of the Golden Fleece was meant to establish Jason as the ruler of his own native country, his ancestral home, Iolcus, in northeastern Greece. I'll put a map image of this on the website. Just visit www.westerncanonpodcast.com and click on the tab labeled links and go to episode number 7, and you'll be able to see this map. Also, remember what Jason is returning home to. Jason's uncle Peleus, who had usurped the Iolcan throne, promised to restore it if Jason retrieved the fleece, which Peleus assumed would be an unimaginable, in fact, impossible feat. So when Jason and Medea return triumphant, Peleus, who still holds the throne, plots to destroy them. And here Medea once again uses her magic and her treachery to effectuate change and help Jason out. What she does is she persuades Peleus' daughters to kill their father Peleus, when what they actually think that they're doing is performing a magic spell to rejuvenate him, because at this point Peleus is a very old man, and so the daughters want to try to make him younger and rejuvenate him, but this magic spell will actually kill him. To convince Peleus' daughters, Medea takes an old feeble sheep, cuts it into little pieces, and throws these pieces into a cauldron with herbs and magic potions. The result of this trick is that a little sprightly, rejuvenated lamb comes jumping out of the cauldron, and obviously Medea works her magic to make this happen. And so Medea tells Peleus' daughters, look, kill your father, chop him up, throw him into a cauldron, and he'll come out a rejuvenated man. See what I was able to do with the sheep? That same thing can happen for your father. Just let me work my magic. The daughters then eagerly chop up their father in order to save him, but Medea this time prevents the charm from working. Euripides actually dramatizes this scene in his now lost Pleiades, which was staged as part of his first tragic trilogy, and that was in 455 BC. And so, as a result of this ploy, Peleus ends up dead, technically killed by his own daughters, but quite honestly, he is actually killed by Medea, and so this is actually her second violent murder. Unfortunately, this does not work to secure for Jason the throne, but rather Jason and Medea are forced to flee Iolcus. They have to flee once again, and this is when they go to Corinth, and they go to Creon, the king of Corinth, who takes them in and gives them refuge there. This, by the way, I should note, is not the same Creon of Thebes from Sophocles' works. But at this point, we see that both Jason and Medea have become permanent outcasts from their respective ancestral cities. Neither Medea nor Jason can return to their homelands because of what has happened. The two are essentially exiles, cut off from the high rank and power to which their births would have given them access. But some years later, Jason has glimpsed a route to regaining his noble stature, this time through the Corinthian royal house. I should mention that by this point, enough time has passed that Medea and Jason have lived together for some years, and Medea has given birth to 2 sons by Jason. So at this point, Jason decides to repudiate Medea and to marry Creon's daughter, Glauce. This will enable him to attain wealth and to regain his noble status. He casts off Medea, which is evidently easier to do given that their pledges to one another were done in haste and in a foreign country, and according to Greek marriage standards, these vows were to be regarded as illegitimate and non-binding. So this was easy for Jason to do. No one is going to have sympathy for Medea based on the rules and standards of ancient Greece. Now, in addition to this, we learn from the tutor to Medea's children that King Creon has decreed Medea must leave Corinth forever with her sons, and this will remove any threat that she might pose to the newly married princess, his daughter. Now, Euripides' tragedy Medea doesn't cover these background details in any depth. What the play does is pick up the story at the moment when Medea learns that Jason is going to marry Glauce. At this point, the story focuses on Medea's reaction to Jason's new marriage and the brutal revenge that she will, in fact, take on him. Now, if you're interested in the story of Jason and the Argonauts, you might consider reading the Argonautica, which is an ancient Greek epic written by Apollonius of Rhodes in the 3rd century BC. This work is often referred to as Jason and the Golden Fleece, or Jason and the Voyage of Argo. If you go on Amazon and buy it, that's probably what it will be called. The text is actually the only surviving Hellenistic epic, and again, it tells the myth of Jason's voyage with the Argonauts to retrieve that golden fleece from the remote Colchis. Now, another version of this, of course, is the 1963 film version of this story, and that is called Jason and the Argonauts. And this is, of course, famous for using Ray Harryhausen's famous special effects. It's directed, I believe, by John Chafee. So I actually grew up watching this film and other Ray Harryhausen films like Sinbad the Sailor and Clash of the Titans. Harryhausen is famous for his stop-motion model animation. It's really cool looking. They used to call this dynamation, and so you should check out his films. Here's a preview of Jason and the Argonauts.
Now, from the makers of Sinbad, Columbia Pictures presents Jason and the Argonauts, the mightiest band of warriors the world has ever known.
Turn back, Jason! We're trapped!
Sailing to the ends of the earth, battling against an incredible number of obstacles.
Where will you find this miracle? I have heard there is a tree at the end of the world, with a fleece of gold hanging in its branches.
In search of the fabulous magic Golden Fleece, Jason and the Argonauts, caught in the clutches of the towering bronze giant Talos, battered by treacherous falling rocks, taming vulturous harpies, facing the dreaded seven-headed Hydra, battling the merciless army of skeletons. Jason and the Argonauts, the classic story of Jason, a man who challenged the gods. Medea, a temple dancer who betrayed a kingdom for love. The Argonauts, the mightiest band of warriors the world has ever known. Jason and the Argonauts, a classic adventure story, brought to the screen through the incredible special effects magic of Dinorama. Jason and the Argonauts, the search that became a legend.
Yes, so much yes there with Ray Harryhausen back in 1963. I really would recommend this film. It's a little cheeky and retro, but it's actually a beautifully made movie, and In fact, a good movie. Rotten Tomatoes gave it a 93%. It really is entertaining, and the cinematography is so cool. The story is obviously altered in many ways, but I would still encourage you to check it out. If you do, you'll get to meet Medea, the, quote, temple dancer. So that is all good and all fun. And so that's the background of the play. The play itself officially opens with Medea grieving over the loss of her husband's love. Her elderly nurse and the chorus of Corinthian women, these women are generally sympathetic to her plight. They fear what she might do to herself or her children now that Jason has left her. The nurse, Medea's nurse, opens the play by saying, "I wish the ship, the Argo, had never flown to Colchis, that hands of noble men hadn't rowed in search of the Golden Fleece for Peleus, for then my mistress, Medea, would not have sailed to the towers of Iolcus, struck to the heart with passion for Jason. But now all is hate, the bonds of love are sick, a traitor to his children and my mistress, Jason spends his nights in a royal bed. He's married to the daughter of Creon, and Medea, wretched and dishonored, lies without food, flattened by her pain, melting into tears at every instant since she discovered how her husband wrongs her, a man who dishonors and demeans her now. She hates the children, gets no joy from them. I fear her, fear she's planning something strange. Her mind is oppressed and dangerous. She won't put up with abuse. I know her, and I fear her, fear she might thrust a knife through her own liver, or kill the king and the new bride and groom, and then take on even greater misfortune, for she inspires dread. If you make her your enemy, no victory song for you." So this is the way that the play opens, not with Medea, but with a dramatic second-hand account of Medea. Now here, Medea is painted as a dangerous woman who will take her revenge, and the nurse seems genuinely afraid. Following this characterization by the nurse, a group of Corinthian women appear. These women will be the chorus of the play. Remember, it's the job of the chorus to provide commentary on the events that happen in the play and offer expository information about those events. So a group of Corinthian women appear and remark that they hear Medea is suffering and want to know why. Now the nurse explains what Medea has been going through, and at this point we hear Medea herself shrieking from indoors, crying that she wishes fire would come down from the sky and shatter her skull. Medea shrieks, quote, "I'm so unfortunate, miserable in pain. How can I end this?" And here is the first moment when we see Medea finally appear on stage. She's crying, but she addresses the chorus, the women of Corinth. She laments that Jason has left her and she wants to die. "This bolt from the blue," she says, "has struck me down. I'm finished. I've abandoned all life's joy. My dear friends, I long for death." Following these remarks, Medea delivers one of the more famous speeches in Western literature. Standing in front of her and Jason's house, addressing the chorus, she says, "Of all creatures that live and understand, we women suffer the most. In the first place, we must, for a vast sum, buy a husband. What's worse, our bodies get a master. And here's what's most at stake. Did we get a man who's good or bad? For women have no seemly escape. We can't deny our husbands. We've come to a household with new habits, new rules, and we must divine how best to manage our bedmates using skills we never learned at home." And I'm going to skip a short bit here. And she says, quote, "A man, when he is vexed by those at home, goes out to ease the disquiet in his heart. But we have only one person to look to. And they say of us that we're never at risk, sheltered at home while they fight with spears. How wrong they are. I'd rather 3 times over stand behind a shield than give birth once." And so that's that quote right there that I just read. That is one of the more famous lines in all of Greek tragedy, that Medea says, "I'd rather 3 times over stand behind a shield than give birth once." And I'll continue with Medea's speech. She says, quote, "The story's not the same, though, for you and me. You have this city and your father's houses, the joy of life and company of friends. I'm on my own. I have no city. My husband abuses me. I was brought as booty from far away, and I have no mother, brother, or kin to give me shelter from this storm of trouble. So I ask you only this. Keep my secret, if a way is found, a scheme to pay my husband back for what he's done. In other things, a woman is full of fear, but when she's wronged in marriage, no mind's more deeply stained with blood than hers. So in this passage, we get a few distinct messages. The first is acknowledgement, I would say, of women's humanity. The passage that I just read for you starts off with the subordinating conjunction of all creatures that live and understand. And so this preface seems to acknowledge that women are creatures with a right to life, but that they're also possessed of reason and understanding. Women, like men, are rational, reflective beings, and given this fact, Medea seems to be arguing, why must they be the ones who suffer the most? Secondly, this passage acknowledges, I suppose you could say, women's lack of autonomy and choice in their marital relationships. At a time in which so many marriages were arranged and or impossible to get out of, Medea's lament here makes sense. She says, quote, "We must for a vast sum buy a husband. What's worse, our bodies get a master." Unquote. And then she says, quote, "Did we get a man who's good or bad?" And this last question, I think, just illustrates the random fortuitousness of a lot of ancient marriages. And in line with this, Medea then goes on to lament her lack of support. For Medea, unlike other married women, she doesn't have viable male relatives who can actually help her when she's in need. Now, of course, Medea fails to mention that this is entirely her fault. She has betrayed her own father, killed her brother, and run away with Jason. She then goes on to utter her famous line, saying that men call women, quote, sheltered, and that they fail to recognize the sacrifices and hardships that they face while glorifying their own contributions, fighting with spears, and that she would rather stand behind a shield and fight with spears any day than go through the pain of childbirth. Medea does acknowledge here that she has no family now. Colchis is another lifetime now, and things are going to get bloody before long. At this point, a new figure approaches Medea from the direction of the royal palace, and it's Creon, the king of Corinth. Creon says, quote, "You, Medea, who scowl and rage at your husband, I've told the world that you must leave this land, an exile, and take with you your 2 children. There can be no delay. I've made my judgment. I won't go back home until I drive you beyond the limits of the land." And to this, Medea shouts, "Aye, aye, I'm destroyed. It's all over. Oh, misery. Why do you drive me from this land, Creon?" And Creon responds, quote, and here I imagine Creon moving closer to Medea in order to make his confession. "I fear you," he says frankly. "No need to disguise my reasons. I fear you might do my child fatal harm. And there are many indications I am right. You were born clever. You have dangerous skills. And the loss of your marriage bed gives you pain. They tell me you'll act against me and the groom and bride I gave away. So before we suffer, I'll mount my defense. I'm better off, woman, if I incur your hatred now, rather than be soft and later lament." So here, responding to Creon's accusation that she is too clever, Medea makes a quite probing observation and says something very interesting that I think can be interpreted in a number of ways. She says, quote, "My reputation's hurt me and done me harm. No man in his right mind should ever overeducate his children, make them too smart. Besides appearing idle, they will harvest the envy and ill will of fellow citizens. If you offer new and clever thoughts to fools, you'll seem to them both worthless and unwise. Beyond this, if they think you better than those they think know something, you'll seem harmful to the city. I myself have shared this fate. Because I'm clever, some men bear me a grudge. But you fear me, thinking you'll suffer. What, something harsh? Don't fear, Creon. I'm not like that, not one to cause offense to men in power. What wrong have you done me? You gave your daughter to the man you liked. It's my husband I hate. Celebrate the marriage and be well. Only let me live here in this land." Now to this, Creon repeats that Medea has to leave, but when Medea pleads for him to just give her one more day, a day to plan for her exile and find refuge for her children, Creon capitulates. He says he'll grant her one more day, reasoning that one day couldn't possibly be enough time for her to, quote, "do the harm I fear," and thus the two of them reach an agreement that he will give her one more day. When Creon leaves, Medea then turns to the chorus of Corinthian women. The women ask what she'll do, where she'll go. And Medea responds slyly, quote, "Don't think this is how it's going to end. There's a challenge yet for the newlyweds, and no small upset for the one who made the match. Do you think I would have groveled as I did before that man except to help myself and further my designs? He's a fool. He lost his chance to ruin my strategy by casting me out of this land. Instead, he gave me one more day. One day in which to make corpses of 3 enemies, the father, the daughter, and my husband." Unquote. She then begins plotting aloud to the chorus, listing different ways that she might kill Creon, Jason, and Glauce. Should she put a torch to their home, burning them alive? Or thrust a sharp knife through their livers while they're sleeping? No, maybe not. If she got caught breaking and entering, she'd likely be killed. No, a better way, she reasons to the chorus, is to use poison. She could poison them and then find a place of asylum to escape to, a foreign city perhaps. Yeah, but this could get complicated. Maybe it'd be better just to use a sword. At this point, Medea warns the women not to, quote, "suffer the mockery of a, quote, Sisyphean marriage." If you remember, Sisyphus, too, was king of Corinth and therefore an ancestor of Creon's. This is also an apt reference because, as most people probably know, Sisyphus was associated with a terrible crime and punishment. And so now Medea gives a speech in which she begins to psych herself up. She invokes Hecate, the goddess of magic, witchcraft, and the moon. Hecate is invoked in a similar way in Macbeth, if you remember, and says to herself, quote, "Come now, Medea, spare none of your skill as you devise and execute your plan. Go forward into danger, test your courage, hold their wrongs before your eyes. You have a noble father, descended from the sun." And here she's referring to the god Helios, obviously. "You have the skill. And after all, we're women," Medea says confidingly to the chorus, "most helpless when it comes to noble deeds, but most skillful at constructing every evil." And here this speech by Medea reminds us of Lady Macbeth's soliloquies before murdering King Duncan. And now we've come to the first choral ode of the play. A choral ode, for those of you who are new to tragedy, is an elaborately structured poem praising or glorifying an event or individual. A classic ode is structured in 3 major parts. You have the strophe, the antistrophe, and the epode. And so the women of the chorus in this ode sing a song about the experience of women over the years. Women have been treated so badly throughout time that it's like the universe is askew, and the women hope that one day their gender will rise to a place of respect. That's what this ode is about, the kind of respect that they deserve. And I'll give you a little quote from this. "Uphill flow streams from sacred springs. The balance in all things is reversed. Men's designs are deceitful. Their oaths, sealed by the gods, dissolve. Common talk will change, and a woman's life will shine with glory. Honor comes to women. The harsh sound of ill repute will bind them no more." So the chorus here seems to be empathizing with Medea and sympathizing with her miserable fate. They agree that Medea has little choice in seeking revenge at any cost, and as they finish their song, Medea's husband Jason now appears on stage for the first time in this play. So Jason appears here, and he is, let's just put it honestly, he is completely unapologetic. He attempts to explain himself, though. Jason says that he doesn't love Glauce, but he just can't pass up the opportunity to marry a wealthy royal princess. Remember here that Medea is from Colchis, and again is considered a barbarian witch by the Greeks. Jason, by way of placation, claims that he hopes one day to join the two families and keep Medea as his mistress. But Medea and the chorus of women do not believe him. Medea reminds Jason that she made sacrifices. She left her own people for him, murdering her own brother for his sake. And now she can never return home. She also reminds him that it was she herself who saved him, slaying the dragon which guarded the Golden Fleece. But Jason is unmoved. He responds to her, and just a word to the wise here, do not respond to your wife this way ever. Jason says, I've often heard that a harsh temper is impossible to deal with. You had the choice of living here, having a home, calmly accepting your superior's will. But no, for the sake of useless talk, you'll leave. Consider exile a small price to pay for what you've said against the rulers here. A profit, really. I've tried to soothe their rage. I'd prefer for you to stay, but you can't let your folly go. You keep on slandering the king. And so, you'll leave. So Medea responds by saying, look, I helped you get the Golden Fleece, and I helped you escape, and I betrayed my father and fled with you, and killed Peleus for you. And she says, quote, and after all I'd done for you, worst of men, you betrayed me. We had children, but you took a new wife. Had you been childless, I could forgive lust for a new woman. But now your oaths mean nothing, and I had placed my hopes in you. So to this, Jason amazingly says, and as you can see, this is the stuff almost of soap opera. Jason says to Medea, since you inflate your generosity, I claim Cypris was savior of my voyage. She, no other god or mortal, saved me. Cypris, by the way, is another name for Aphrodite, the goddess of sexual love. Eros, of course, is Aphrodite's son, who carries a bow and arrows that cause whomever they strike to fall in love. So here Jason is basically saying that Aphrodite made Medea fall in love with him. So they technically deserve credit, Aphrodite and Eros, for his success in winning the Golden Fleece, and certainly not Medea. And Jason goes on, quote, it wasn't too bad, the help you gave me then. But even so, you got more than you gave for my salvation, as I will now lay out. And so Jason then goes on to explain that, look, because of me, you get to live, quote, in Greece, and not your homeland. You know justice and rule of law that doesn't brook the use of force. All Greeks know of your skill. You're famous. If you were living at the ends of the earth, no one would have heard of you. Then Jason proceeds to explain to Medea that she has it all wrong. In reality, look, Jason is just being, quote, prudent. He says, quote, I acted as a great friend to you and the children, unquote. Calm down, he tells her, and I'll paraphrase here. He basically says, think about it. I'm in exile. Who knew if I'd even survive? And here I am, getting to marry the daughter of the king? I know you're jealous, and I know it gnaws at you. But I'm not marrying Glauce because I'm attracted to her. I care deeply about both you and the children. Think of it this way. I figure I'm doing this for you guys. And I'll give you Jason's actual words here. Quote, no, my main concern was that we would all live and wouldn't be in need. Two families in one. I've planned well, no? You wouldn't deny it if jealousy didn't gnaw at you, unquote. And then Jason deals what is probably the ultimate nail in his own children's coffins. Although he probably doesn't realize it, he says, quote, you women are so far gone. Really, mortals should reproduce in some other vessel. The female sex should not exist. Then no more trouble would afflict mankind, unquote. Jason then tells her that if she'll just go away in exile, he'll make sure she's taken care of. He'll send her money. He says, quote, I'll send tokens to my friends. They'll treat you well. You're a fool, woman, if you're not willing to take it. You'll profit more if you end your anger. To which Medea responds, quote, I wouldn't make use of any friend of yours, nor would I take anything for you. Give me nothing. The gift of a bad man is no help. And at this, Jason takes his leave. The chorus then sings a song about Medea's plight, and just as everything seems completely hopeless, a new character shows up in the play, and it is Aegeus, the childless king of Athens. So Aegeus says that he has come to ask the renowned sorceress, that would be Medea, to help his wife conceive a child, a son, and that this was on the advice of Phoebus, an ancient oracle at Delphi. In return, Medea asks for his protection, and although Aegeus is not aware of Medea's plan for revenge, he promises to give her refuge, providing her a place to live if she can only escape to Athens. And in exchange for sanctuary in Athens, Medea, using her sorcery, would be able to help Aegeus bear a child with his wife. So Medea, not fully trusting the king, makes him swear an oath. She says, quote, "The houses of Peleus and Creon are my enemy. If the oath I ask for binds you," she says, "you have to swear that you, quote, won't send me away when they come for me. My position is weak," she admits, "while they have wealth and power on their side. Swear by the earth and by sun, father of my father, and the whole race of gods all in one. Never expel me from your land. Never, if one of my enemies wants to take me, never willingly hand me over while you live." And so Aegeus agrees to this deal, and a friendship has been sealed. Now, with the king of Athens gone, Medea turns to the chorus once more and makes a long speech, relaying her murderous revenge plot to the Corinthian women. She will take revenge on Jason. So here's the plan. First, she says, "I will meet with Jason and pretend to forgive him. Then, when he's buttered up, I'll ask him to let our children live here in Corinth as I go into exile. Then," she says, "I will, quote, send my sons with gifts in their arms, a delicate robe and headband of beaten gold. If she," and here Medea is referring to the princess Glauce, "if she takes the ornaments, puts them on her skin, she'll die. And all who touch her, a terrible death. I'll anoint my gifts with poison that can do this," unquote. And so now we have the plan. Medea, using her gifts as a sorceress, will anoint a beautiful gown with poison. The princess, when she puts this gown on, will die, and then anyone who thereafter touches her will also die. She continues, quote, "I weep for what I must do, for then I'll kill my children. And when I've annihilated Jason's house, I'll leave this place, free from the murder of my dear sons. So be it. I made my mistake when I left my family home, when I listened to the words of a Greek, a man who will now be punished, God willing. The children I bore him, he'll never see alive again. He'll never have a child with his new bride. The wretched woman must die from my poison, a wretched death." So here the Corinthian women try to stop Medea. They tell her that she should not kill her children. It will only make her more miserable and downtrodden. But Medea responds, quote, "There's no other way. But I excuse you for saying this. You have not suffered as I have." "Will you kill your flesh and blood?" the women ask. And Medea says, quote, "I must. It's the only way to wound my husband." After another choral ode, Jason enters the scene from the direction of the royal palace, because apparently he's been called for by Medea. He asks Medea impatiently what she wants. Medea then apologizes obsequiously. She tells him she was hot under the collar before and that she really does appreciate all he's done. He had been totally justified in seeking out a different marriage. It was, after all, best for both of them and preferable for the children. So now Jason is growing pleased with how events are panning out. He's glad that Medea has come to her senses finally. And in this moment, as Medea is speaking to him, Jason reimagines his future destiny. After growing into young warriors under the watchful eye of the gods, his children from both marriages could come together and make him a proud father by campaigning against his enemies. So remember, Medea has begged for Jason to let their two sons stay in Corinth so that they'll be able to be raised and privileged. And Jason has to think about this. When Jason indicates uncertainty over being able to convince the king of this plan, Medea comes up with an idea. Medea tells him to ask his wife Glauce to make the plea to her father instead. Medea now tells Jason that she has an idea. What if their two sons brought a beautiful gown and coronet to Creon's daughter? And then Creon's daughter might be convinced to persuade her father to let the boys stay. So if we just bribe Glauce, she might consent. She might be flattered enough to let the two boys stay. So Jason thinks this plan over and eventually concedes, agreeing to the plan. So Jason and his two sons, as well as their tutor and the box with the deadly gown and coronet, all exit the stage toward the Corinthian palace. After a while, the tutor returns from the palace with the two boys and tells Medea he has good news. Good luck! The princess accepted Medea's gifts and was able to persuade the king to let Medea's sons remain in the city of Corinth. Now, predictably, hearing this news does not please Medea, who had likely hoped instead to hear news of Glauce's gruesome death. And here Medea weeps, addressing her children and delivering the following tragic speech. Quote, "O children, my two children, you have a city and a home in which you'll live on always without your mother. I, an exile, will travel to another land before I have delight in seeing you happy, before tending to your wedding bath, your bride, your nuptial bed, or holding the marriage torches. O misery born of my stubborn will! I've brought you up to no purpose then, to no purpose I toiled, wore myself out, bore the harsh pains of childbirth. I'm wretched now, but once was full of hope that you would care for me in my old age, lay me out on my deathbed with your own hands. Men would have envied me, but now this sweet thought is shattered. Why do your eyes rest on me, children? Why smile one last smile when you see me? What should I do? I'm losing heart as I look on my children's bright faces." And here Medea, in this speech, actually reconsiders her plan to kill her children. But then suddenly she snaps out of it. She says, quote, "But no, what's happening to me? Do I want to be mocked while my enemies go unpunished? I must steel myself." Then a few moments later, she freezes once more and tells herself, quote, Don't do this, my strong spirit. Leave them be, miserable heart. Spare these children. They'll bring you joy, living there with you." She then rallies once more, turning on a dime. "By the spirits of vengeance who dwell in Hades," she assures herself, "I will not hand over my sons to my enemies to be abused." Medea grabs her children and speaks to them, bestowing sweet words of affection and melancholy sadness. And as the chorus sings a song about both the joy and the emotional difficulty of being a parent, Medea sends her children inside the house, at which point she sees a messenger arrive. The messenger, she notices, is out of breath. Hurriedly, the messenger urges Medea to, quote, "Take flight, go by land or sea, use any boat or cart to get away. The young girl, royal bride, and Creon her father are dead, killed just now, and by your poisons. When your two sons arrived with their father and entered the house of the newlyweds, we were glad, we household slaves who felt the stress at your troubles." The messenger describes the gory scene in detail. "When she, Glauce, saw their gifts, she took the gorgeous robes and put them on. She placed the golden band around her curls and looked in a bright mirror to arrange her hair. Then she stood up from her chair and walked around the room, her white feet stepping softly. She loved the gifts. What happened then was terrible to see. Her skin changed color. She lurched backwards, trembling in every limb. Then she saw the white foam bubbling from her mouth, her pupils turned back in the sockets of her eyes, her bloodless skin. The cry turned into a great wailing shriek. It took the time a sprinter takes to fly to the finish of a one-stayed course, that's 200 yards, by the way, for the wretched girl to rouse herself and cry out in horror. Her eyes and mouth no longer shut. The pain was attacking her on a double front. The band of gold she'd placed around her head shot out an astonishing stream of devouring fire. The delicate robe was gnawing at the white flesh of the doomed girl. On fire, she rises from the chair and runs about, shaking her head and hair in all directions. Overcome by suffering, she falls to the floor. No one could recognize her. Only her father could. Her eyes and fine-boned face no longer had a clear shape. Blood and fire mingled together fell dripping from her head. Her skin, like the sap of a fir tree, oozed off her bones, loosed by the jaws of the unseen poison. An awful sight. Everyone feared to touch the corpse." Unquote. Yikes. So that is a pretty graphic description. Now when he arrived, the messenger continued, King Creon tried to take her gnarled and mangled body in his arms, weeping. But he soon found he was stuck to her robe like, quote, ivy to a laurel branch. He, quote, tried to get up on his knees, but the corpse kept pulling him back. If he moved with force, he ripped his aging flesh from the bone. In time, he gave it up and breathed his last. The bodies of the child and aged father lie side by side, a misfortune calling for tears. Now, after this gut-wrenching description of the scene of the murder, upon the messenger's exit, Medea decides it's time, and she goes into her house to kill her children. It isn't enough that she has killed Glauce, the bride of Jason. It isn't enough that she has killed King Creon. It isn't enough that she's killed his uncle Peleus. It isn't enough that she has killed her brother. She again has to talk herself into killing the deed, saying firmly this time, quote, don't turn coward. Don't think of the children. Don't remember that you bore them, that they're most loved. Now, outside, while all of this is happening, while Medea is inside killing the children, killing her own children, the chorus sings a dirge, lamenting the horrors of this tragedy. And as they do this, they hear the scream of a child from inside the house. Oi moi! The first child screams. Do you hear? The chorus wails. Hear the cry of children, wretched doomed woman. We are lost. The second child screams from inside of the house. Please, God, help! The first child screams again. And as the chorus announces the death of the two children, Medea's two children, suddenly Jason appears, sprinting and out of breath. Where is Medea? He shouts. Where are my boys? So the chorus tells Jason where his boys are, inside the house. Jason, by the way, is fully aware that it was Medea who killed the king and his bride, and Jason now says that he's worried at what Medea might do to their sons. And at this point, the chorus gives in, telling Jason that he is right to be worried, as they reveal to him that Medea has, in fact, killed his children. In disbelief, Jason attempts to break through the locked doors of the house, and this, finally, is how the play ends. Medea appears now on the roof of the house in a chariot, with the boys' corpses beside her. She announces that her grandfather, the sun god, gave her this chariot to protect her from her enemies. Jason shouts up at her, calling her the, quote, greatest enemy to the gods and me and the whole human race. You dared, he says, you who bore them to thrust a sword into the children, made me childless, ruined me. I want you dead. You killed your brother. There isn't a woman in Greece, no Greek woman, who would have dared this. And to this, Medea unapologetically responds, once you'd dishonored my marriage bed, you weren't going to mock me and enjoy your life, nor was the princess. Go on, call me lioness if you want, call me Scylla. I've done what I had to do to wring your heart. And hurt yourself, Jason shouts to her bitterly. No doubt, Medea shoots back, dead-eyed. But it's worth the pain if you're not laughing. And here, as the play comes to a close, the two, Jason and Medea, go at each other back and forth, trading savage insults as Medea says to Jason, you, a bad man, will die a bad death, as suits you. Foul child killer, Jason spits back. Go to the palace and bury your wife, Medea responds. And so you killed them, Jason cries out in disbelief, in absurd disbelief. And Medea responds, to cause you pain. I need in my despair to kiss their mouths, to kiss their dear mouths. You talk to them now. Now you embrace them, Medea says. Then you pushed them away. Jason curses Medea a couple more times and cries that he wishes his children had never been born. And Medea flies away. And this is how the tragedy ends. All right, so I just want to make now a few comments about this play before we get to our interview with the Euripides translator Diane Arnson Svarlien. So although this play is now considered one of the great plays of ancient Greece, I should point out that the Athenian audience didn't exactly see it that way at the time, and as a consequence, they awarded it third place out of 3 places at the city Dionysia festival in 431 BC. This may have been in part due to the stylistic conventions that Euripides experimented with and the changes he made to some of the long-standing conventions of Greek theater. In Medea, Euripides does some interesting things. He includes an indecisive chorus, which was novel at that time, a chorus that flip-flops, expressing varying levels of support for Medea's choices and wavering back and forth on the advice that they give to Medea. The women in this chorus are alternately horrified and beguiled by Medea, really, in a way, living vicariously through her. They both condemn her at times and pity her for her horrible acts, but really do nothing to interfere. And Euripides, you can see, also implicitly criticizes Athenian society by showing disrespect for the gods, rendering them morally suspect in many ways. This was Plato's criticism, remember, of poets. Poets were destabilizing to society since they were presenting the gods in a morally questionable light. So another one of the things I want to talk about is Euripides' portrayal of the character of Medea. The play Medea, in many ways, is a character study. While reading the play, it's easy to forget that Medea is actually a sorceress, that she actually has magical abilities. Throughout the duration of the story, Euripides really develops Medea's character in a way that downplays that magical ability, focusing instead on her humanity and her very human qualities of cleverness, strength of will, and cunning. Even though Medea does clearly use magic to help Jason capture the Golden Fleece and escape, she uses magic to poison Glauce with the robe, and she relies on magic and her family's divinity to do many things in the play. She gets help from her grandfather, the sun god Helios, to escape at the end of the play, flying away in a chariot drawn by dragons. Even though we see that Medea does use magic to achieve certain ends, that in and of itself is not the point of the play. The point of the play is to dramatize Medea's, you might call it, human all too humanness and her agony. This character study is even easier to develop in the case of this particular type of stage format. Like with nearly all Greek tragedies, the play doesn't require any change of scene and takes place entirely outside of Jason and Medea's abode in Corinth. The setup is very simple. Many of the violent and cataclysmic events occur offstage. For example, the deaths of Glauce and Creon, and even Medea's murder of her own children are described in elaborate speeches delivered by a messenger, rather than enacted before the audience. And this gives us a close-up shot of Medea for nearly the entire play, and it gives us the chance to examine her psyche and see things almost through her eyes. And it's interesting. Given the horrifying nature of Medea's crimes, given the utter brutality and ruthlessness of her behavior, killing her brother, a king, a princess, and her own 2 children, it's strange that Medea is portrayed in such a sympathetic light. It strikes many readers as puzzling that the play seems to present Medea in terms that are positive rather than negative. Medea, in a way, is cast as the victim. One of the ways Euripides does this is by presenting Medea as the paradigm of the wronged wife. And so this raises a pressing question that readers are always prompted to weigh in on after they've read the Medea, and one that I think is unavoidable in any discussion of Medea. To what extent are we meant to have sympathy for Medea as a character? Does Euripides paint Medea as a tragic figure that we should feel sorry for? It does kind of seem that way. Is Medea a, quote, tragic hero? And we have to then ask, would it even be right to feel sympathy or express understanding for someone who takes the lives of innocent people and murders her own children? I would argue that perhaps we don't even need to answer this question. Maybe we can feel bad for Medea's plight, her circumstances, her treatment at the hands of Jason, even if we don't agree with her method of taking revenge. Maybe we should view Medea as something akin to an early stage version of a Quentin Tarantino film, in the sense that we're meant to feel for Medea as a character and then watch with a kind of numb, nihilistic glee as she does everything she can in the world to take revenge and hurt Jason and leave him basically a smoldering wreck for the rest of his life. What I will say is that Euripides, in characterizing Jason, gives us no shortage of ammo. He creates in Jason a character who is condescending, morally bankrupt, opportunistic, selfish, unscrupulous. One of the hard things about putting these characters into their proper context is that anyone who reads this play, this particular play, anyone who reads it knows ahead of time, before even reading the play, that Medea is a sorceress who kills her children. That's what the play is about. We know this ahead of time. It's baked into the cake. And so as we approach this text for the first time, we wonder if we're going to be able to empathize with Medea at all. And as we read on, we find that Medea, despite her monstrosity, is someone who becomes very human for us, someone for whom we can feel pangs of sympathy. And yet, as we read, one thing that we're not prepared for, I would argue, is how despicable and cruel Jason is as a character. As we read on, we begin to feel less and less sympathy for the horror that we know in time Jason will suffer. In many ways, just like the Iliad, I wouldn't put it out of the question for readers to see the Medea as an allegorical tale, as a kind of didactic lesson, a moral warning against infidelity and cruelty in the marital relationship. And so this brings up one of the themes of the Medea, which is vengeance. Medea's anger, her rage in this play, strikes us in many ways as justified. Her anger, not her actions, but her anger is justified. As a husband, Jason abandons Medea and proves that he never actually loved her, or that if he did, his love was fickle, fleeting. In the mythical background leading up to this play, Medea betrays her family, sacrifices everything to be with Jason. But in return, not only does he leave Medea for a beautiful young princess, he does nothing to stop the king from exiling Medea from Corinth, which you would think that he would if he cared about her at all. For all of these reasons, the chorus, the moral center of the Greek tragedy, mostly supports Medea as she plots her revenge up until the point that she decides to kill her own children. The chorus warns Medea that in hurting Jason in this way, she'll cause far more pain to herself and her children. But Medea declares that the pain she will suffer is worth the horror it will cause Jason. So Euripides explores, you might say, the limits of vengeance and punishment in depicting this perverse, excessive, and horrifying response to betrayal. And you might argue that that's the point of this play. Another theme in the Medea that I think is at least worth mentioning is the utter hubris, the excess of pride and arrogance of the male characters like Jason and Creon. Throughout the play, these two characters underestimate and disregard Medea, and despite her demonstrated magical powers, both men seem to believe that they can control her in order to achieve their own ends, in order to achieve their own desires. And this pride, this hubris, blinds both of them to Medea's true aims, and I would argue prevents them from stopping her revenge. So, okay, I know that there is much more to discuss about this play. We could talk all day about this play and the themes in it, as well as Euripides, Medea, the staging of plays like these. But to do that, to further this discussion, I'd like to bring on a special guest recommended to us by the classicist Daniel Mendelsohn. And this guest is Diane Arnson Svarlien. Dr. Arnson Svarlien is a verse translator and classicist who lives in Lexington, Kentucky. Her translations of poets like Sappho, Simonides, Theocritus, Catullus, Horace, and Ovid have appeared in numerous journals and anthologies, including The Greek Poets, Homer to the Present, that's Norton 2010. She has also published 3 collections of translations of the plays of Euripides. The first is called Alcitus Medea Hippolytus, that's 2007. Her second is Andromache, Hecuba, Trojan Women, that's 2012. And the third anthology that she's translated is called Ion, Helen, Orestes. And all of these anthologies are put out by Hackett Publishing. Diane has taught at Georgetown College, and she has studied at the University of Texas at Austin, where she earned her PhD in classics and her MA in Greek. She also studied at the University of Virginia, where she earned her BA in English and Classics. She was awarded a Literature Fellowship by the National Endowment for the Arts in 2010. Hi, Dr. Arnson Svarlien. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. I'm excited to be talking to you. Looking forward to talking about Euripides and translating.
Again. Great. So you are a translator. You've translated numerous works, and your specialty is, from what I gather, Euripides. You've also translated Ovid, Catullus, Sappho. In June 2016, you published a collection of Euripides' plays. This was called Euripides, Ion, Helen, Orestes. There it is. And it was published by Hackett. So for my listeners, if you're looking for a great stage-worthy, accessible translation of these plays, you should pick up a copy of Dr. Arnson Svarlien's work, and that is Euripides, Ion, Helen, Orestes. So let me ask you before I want to get into actually talking about your approach to translation, but before we do, because we're kind of in that spot, I want to ask you, how healthy would you say is the discipline right now? Is classics in a good way?
Well, I don't know. I haven't really made a study of it. I mean, it's I guess you measure things with like that sometimes with enrollments in classical languages, both in high schools and colleges. And I think my sense of the field is that people are doing a lot of really interesting work. I guess the place where really firsthand I've seen that classics is struggling is that there are a lot fewer positions for teaching classics at university level, and there are a lot more people coming out with classics PhDs, because who wouldn't want to get a PhD in classics? It's one of the greatest things you can do with a few years of your life to study classics. So there's all kinds of reasons to want to get a PhD, but then once you have one, there are very few jobs at the college university level. So, and I saw that when I left a teaching job that I had in 2010, and because I wanted to really focus on working on translations, and I was involved in hiring the person who replaced me, and it was kind of heartbreaking how many really, really good applications we had for this one little job, and just the quality of people that we had to turn away. So,
sure.
So yeah, the job market right now is really brutal, but
I'm sure that's true across the humanities.
It is very true across the humanities. Yeah. So I think it would be better if and sometimes I think our sort of the status of humanities in our culture isn't what it should be.
I agree with that.
But in terms of actual classicists who are working on stuff, there's a lot of great stuff. There's a lot of interesting stuff being done. So in that sense, it's good.
So, Dr. Arnson Svarlien, in an article you wrote, you started by saying, and I want to transition here into the art of translation, into what it is that you do and your approach. In an article you wrote, you started by saying that there's more than one way to skin a cat, and you said something else that I thought was interesting. That Daniel Mendelsohn and Emily Wilson, when they were on this podcast, they didn't touch on this. You said the following, and this clarified a lot for me in thinking about the project of translation. You were writing about a few of the variables, and you say, quote, "Each language has its own resources. Each age has its own idiom and conventions, and each translator has his or her own understanding of what," and you were writing about Euripides, of what Euripides' voice sounds like in Greek. And then you go on to talk about the way in which translations will be influenced and determined to some degree by who the translator anticipates her audience to be. And you say, quote, "The work may be intended for stage performance, for readers interested in becoming acquainted with the classics, or for lovers of poetry, for students struggling to learn Greek and seeking guidance from an English version, for students and readers who will never study Greek, or for some combination of all of these audiences. So my question for you is, how do you approach translation? What's the balance that you strike? You've translated many Greek plays into English. Who's your audience? Who do you translate for? Lovers of poetry? Are you trying to be accessible? Are you doing this for stage production, or is it some combination? What's your approach to translation?
It is a combination of, I lost count of how many of the different possibilities, but it's a combination of several of them. I think one audience that I'm not writing for is, I mentioned people who, and one very legitimate reason to write a translation is just as a guide to the Greek or the Latin. And that there's the whole, I'm sure you know the Loeb Classical Library series, these volumes that have like the Greek on one side, the Greek and English on facing pages. Or,
I've heard about them.
Yeah. And they're, I have some here. They're these little, here's David Kovacs, Euripides, Loeb.
Gotcha.
The Greek ones have green covers and the Latin ones have red covers. And so the aim of that series it's for people who want to just know what these books say. And you can either sort of read the English but have the Greek right there to look at, if you know like just a little bit of Greek and you just enough to want to have the text there and see what it says. Or if you're trying to read the Greek, but you want the English there because the Greek is hard and you want some help with it. So that series, the translations are written to be a guide to the original text. So the goal of them is just to be really clear and to even reflect the syntax of the original text, if it's possible, and to be a crib, which I think is, that kind of translation is wonderful because it just clearly interprets what's going on in the Greek.
So this is a fine-grained focus, like on the language itself, and just giving you sort of not a word for word, but almost a sentence by sentence translation.
Well, as much as possible, word for word. Just like if you're just trying to figure out exactly what the Greek is saying, then the Loeb Classical Library series or other prose translations also have the same goal. Just here's what it is. But I'm writing a verse translation because I think a translation has to be if you want to read Euripides, it's other than if you're already trying to learn how to read it in Greek because you're already sold on the idea that Euripides is great and you want to read him in Greek. If you're saying, well, who is this Euripides that I've heard so much about? He's supposed to be such a great playwright. I wonder what is so enjoyable about his work. Then, you would want to read an English version that's enjoyable in the same ways that the Greek is. That's written in verse, for one thing, because I think the difference between prose and verse is really important. The translations that I do are trying to, as much as possible, be sort of the same thing in English that Euripides plays are in Greek.
So the qualia of my experience reading the Greek, you're trying to match that for me. Like if I lived in ancient Greece and I could actually hear it being read to me, or if I was sitting down with it and I knew Greek, you're trying to reproduce the qualia of that experience, like the way what it's like to be me reading it. Did I speak Greek? That sort of thing.
Yeah, kind of. And remember, if you were the original audience of one of these plays, you would literally be the audience. You'd be sitting in a theater.
It was musical.
I think it's also important that these were that they're written as performance scripts, not just to be, read in your armchair. Although they can, that's good too. But I also am writing for one of the other audiences that you mentioned, quoting me, the theater audience. So it's important for the language to be speakable and playable. I try to think of what does this sound like if you read it out loud? And of course, since it's verse, since it's poetry, the rhythm is an important thing, as it is in Euripides. And also, the plays are all musicals. I mean, the songs are songs. They were set to music. And so the way that I've translated them is to follow the same type of form that Euripides used, which is all of his songs are composed in pairs of stanzas called strophe and antistrophe. And it's like verses of a song. A song might have 5 verses that all have the same melody, but different words. So strophe and antistrophe are like that. The same melody, different words. The music is lost, or all, actually we have a little bit of the music for Orestes, but we have the meters, the rhythms. And the rhythms of the songs, the lyric meters, are very different from the spoken meters. The spoken parts of the plays are in iambic meter. So for Euripides, Greek, and for all the Greek dramas, the spoken iambic meter it's called an iambic trimeter, but it's 3 ba-bum-ba-bums, 3 sets of 2 iambs.
Gotcha.
So Euripides' iambic trimeter line is ba-bum, 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 ba-bum. It's really 12 syllables, 4 times 3. But for that, I use the sort of no-brainer choice for that in English is to use iambic pentameter, because that's sort of the bread and butter meter of English. So it's a little bit shorter line than Euripides' line, ba-bum, 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 and then plus all the variations that are allowed in that. But then when the choruses start singing, or when often many of the characters have solo songs that are not composed in. Sometimes they're in the strophe antistrophe pattern. Sometimes they're not. Especially later, Euripides has a lot of monodies, these sort of free form songs that don't follow a strophic structure. But when I'm translating those, it's important to remember these are songs. They're song lyrics. They're not just declaimed. So I don't use iambic pentameter for that. And what Euripides does is the meters that he uses in the songs, the strophes and antistrophes, they're not fixed forms. They're free-flowing combinations of different metrical units, like bum pa pa bum pa bum, or something, and or bum pa pa bum bum, and there are different styles of meter. Like there's Aeolic meters, which are similar to like the poetry of Sappho, or there are other meters that are called Ionic or dactyloepitrite. There are different sort of metrical families of types of rhythms, but any given stanza is unique unto itself. It doesn't follow a fixed pattern. It's, Euripides is just, he puts together the rhythms that he wants in a strophe, and then he matches them in the antistrophe. I don't know what his composition process was. Maybe sometimes he came up with the antistrophe and sometimes the strophe. Antistrophe first, strophe second, who knows? When I'm translating, actually, I'll look at the strophe and the antistrophe, and sometimes I'll try to see which one looks harder and do that one first. Like in which one is the content going to be more difficult to work into poetry, or in which one is the syntax more complicated, or, which stanza do I want to do first where I don't have the constraint of, line 3 has to be bum, 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 because whichever stanza I do second is highly constrained by whatever I did in the first stanza. Right. And of course I fiddle back and forth as I'm going along. And I think I've sort of drifted away from answering your original question, but
no, this has all been very informative and useful.
What audience am I writing for? But I'm writing for for readers, but also I hope for a theater audience. And there have been a lot of productions, which is really gratifying to me. I love it when there have been, especially at colleges, there have been some really wonderful productions of these plays, and not just a theater audience, but really a musical theater audience. I mean, ideally, the songs should be set to music. So when I'm writing them, I try to also keep in mind, if someone wanted to set this to music, would it work?
Oh, that's great.
and actually, at that point, I'm sort of out of my depth. It's like, okay, composers, it's up to you now.
That's a lot to consider. So
yeah.
As a prose stylist, how do you feel about Euripides' prose style? I obviously can't read ancient Greek, but how does Euripides as a poet differ from Aeschylus and Sophocles, ignoring the themes and just thinking about the aesthetics in terms of his verse style, in terms of his poetry?
Well, yeah, that's a good question, and that he definitely has his own Euripidean voice. I think it's easiest to contrast with Aeschylus's poetic style, because one way to approach how their styles are different is to read Aristophanes' Frogs, because in that Aristophanes goes down to the underworld because he wants to bring back Euripides, because he loves Euripides. But then when he gets down there, he realizes that there's like a competition going on between Aeschylus and Euripides for who's the better poet and who is going to be the chair of poetry in the underworld. So he has Aeschylus and Euripides as characters making fun of each other's style. And it was actually I translated part of I co-translated the Frogs with Mike Lipman, who's at the University of Nebraska at Lincoln, and the two of us together collaborated on a translation that was produced at Randolph College in Virginia by Amy Cohen, and I'm going to go back and also retranslate all of Frogs for a Hackett volume, which will be kind of different in some ways, but in more of a classroom book maybe. But it was really interesting and fun to come to the Frogs after I've been translating Euripides for however long it's been, I don't know, 20 years or something like that, and then to read Aristophanes' parody of Euripides' style and say, oh yeah, it was like I could get the joke.
Yeah.
Because I'd been reading so much Euripides for so long. But he makes fun of some of Euripides' mannerisms, like the repetitions in his choral lyrics. That's something that, and this is some of the parody in the Frogs is specifically of late Euripides, like you see in my last book, Ion, Helen, and Orestes, those the late plays. And so aside from ways in which you can make fun of it, I think Euripides, in contrast to Aeschylus, is more straightforward, and he's clearer. Aeschylus likes to create really elaborate metaphors, and his language is sometimes very difficult because the ideas are difficult. He's putting things into language that can be very striking and hard to wrap your mind around. And I think Euripides is a little bit more plain spoken and natural sounding. I mean, it's also very highly crafted and poetic, and just it really is songwriting, just the musicality of his poetry But I guess the one word answer is Euripides is simpler.
Yeah, my co-collaborator and I, we were talking about this, and we actually both agreed that even the English translation was hard. It was hard. Now she knows Greek, but we're both doing Aeschylus. We actually thought it was hard. It was dense.
It is dense.
And
yeah.
I'll make a guess, and you can tell me if I'm off here. But it seems like, in terms of how the two tragedians stand now, it seems like Euripides is more widely known now. He's more read now, whereas Aeschylus is kind of pushed aside, so to speak. I have a colleague that told me Aeschylus was actually used to teach students in Byzantium grammar, whereas I don't know if that was the case with Euripides.
Well, I think in the Byzantine period, I think all the tragedians were school texts, and in fact that's it's influenced which texts survived in the greatest number of manuscripts, like which ones became school texts, and that's how we've ended up having the manuscripts that we do in many cases, is because they were used for education. But I think you're right that maybe Euripides is coming more into vogue now than he has been. I remember about maybe I don't know if this has changed, but 10 or 15 years ago, I was looking at the AP curriculum, I guess for AP English, and it said, there was a suggested list of authors that people should be exposed to, and Aeschylus and Sophocles were on it, but not Euripides.
Interesting.
So these things I think the great books proponents of the 20th century were bigger on Aeschylus and Sophocles, and maybe thought Euripides was kind of frivolous or something.
Kind of a wild man.
But in antiquity, well, in the 4th century, after all three of them were dead, Euripides, or all, by them I mean the big three, the three well-known Athenian tragic playwrights, Euripides became the most popular after his death, and there were lots of revivals of classical tragedy in the 4th century, and Euripides was the most performed and most popular author. And the play Orestes was the most popular play of antiquity, which is really interesting because now it's not at all. I don't think anyone ever read it in high school, or maybe you can change this trend. You can.
Do you think it's because we now have the entire Oresteia, where we now have? So that's like that's the only trilogy that we have.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Do you think that might be why we read the Oresteia instead?
It really makes sense that if you're teaching Greek tragedy, Athenian tragedy, it really makes sense to teach the Oresteia, because it's so wonderful that we actually have all three plays of a trilogy, and it's just that one that we have. So how could you not read that, if you want to understand what a trilogy is? Although, of course, an Aeschylean Euripides trilogies, we have the titles of a lot of them, and most of them don't seem to hang together the way the Oresteia does, that following a single plot line through, or a single set of characters through three plays. Some of them were maybe on three different subjects, but thematically connected somehow. We don't really know. And the Oresteia is magnificent too. I mean, it's just incredible, beautiful poetry.
I've been reading it the last 3 days, and I'm floored by it.
Yeah.
And the thing that I was surprised by was that with Euripides, the Orestes didn't look anything like the Oresteia. They're so incredibly different, and I was kind of shocked by that.
Yeah, well, and that's maybe why now I think to many people's taste, they would say, "Yeah, this is shocking. This is a really messed up play. I mean, the people in it are bad people, and they have these crazy wild ideas. It's just a hot mess. Like, why do they want to kill Helen? What good is that going to do? And then what's with this ending? It really, I mean, maybe now, maybe it has more appeal to kind of postmodern tastes because it is
right.
Kind of nihilistic almost. And the characters are really unattractive. They're not likable people. It was super popular in antiquity, and I think it had a lot to do with probably the music too. And that is, we have a fragment of the ancient musical notation for Orestes, and when I came to the part that's covered by that fragment, I followed the meters as they are, in the ancient notation, because I thought, well, and actually a lot of people there's a lot of interesting work going on now with ancient music and reconstructing what that chorus from Orestes sounded like. So I thought, well, if someone wants to reconstruct the music from Orestes and they want to use English instead of Greek, they could use my translation just for that one bit.
I'll tell our next guest. Our next guest actually studies the ancient music of Euripides at Oxford. So that's what he does.
Who's your next guest?
His name is Spencer Clavin. He's been on the show before, and
great. Okay.
And that's what he studies. But I did want to ask you. I actually had a list of things that are different because I started with the Oresteia and then I read Orestes, and the Deus ex machina ending, the abrupt ending, the fact that Orestes and Electra are these kind of messy, unlikable, outlaw type characters. I wanted to ask you why this story, which comes out of a rich mythological, seemingly stable mythological tradition, why is Euripides' version of the events in this story so incredibly different? I mean, some of the glaring differences include the fact that in the Euripides play, Iphigenia isn't dead. The play is set after Orestes kills his mother and Aegisthus, but Iphigenia is alive. Another striking difference I noticed is that in Orestes, the Furies are still with him. Some of them have refused to accept the verdict, and they end up following him around and haunting him, and he's not completely freed from the Furies. Then obviously there's the Menelaus and Helen are there in Euripides' play. That's another change in the storyline, and Orestes appeals to Menelaus, and then you have Helen and Hermione, and he's got a sword to Hermione's neck, and then all of a sudden he's marrying her, and the ending just hit me so fast, and I was so confused, and I'm looking back and forth, and as I said, I'm like reading articles about this and listening to lectures, trying to figure this out. Maybe you could give me a little bit of insight
of why it's so different.
Yeah, why are these stories so different? Where did Euripides get these changes from? Why did he do this? Was he responding to Aeschylus? Was he playing with the genre? I mean, it's not really even a tragedy in any way that I can think of.
Well, it's I guess to start with that, a lot of tragedies, all the Greek tragedies we have are from Athens, and all the complete plays are Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. But there were a lot of other tragic playwrights too. But even in the relatively small proportion of the plays that survived compared to how many there were, not all of the tragedies end badly. Some of them have kind of happy endings, and they're not always about really painful things, so there's nothing about, tragedy, I guess that usually they tend to end badly, like family members kill each other or something like that, but not necessarily.
You're
so
right,
the thing that formally makes a tragedy is the context in which it's performed. It's done at the Dionysia or the Lanaya, It's performed in the tragic competition at a festival of Dionysus, and it follows the formal conventions of a tragedy. It has the dialogues in iambic trimeter, and then the chorus. It has choruses, and it has anapaests. It has, comedy is different in a lot of ways, but part of the differences are formal. It has different. Comedy has some different metrical conventions, and it has this thing called the parabasis. But the definition of a tragedy is really, if it was put on in the tragic competition and for a festival of Dionysus, and it was entered as a tragedy, it's a tragedy. It doesn't.
That's interesting.
It doesn't have it to be tragic in our sense. It could have a happy ending.
So they teach English teachers? They teach English teachers that it's a tragedy if Aristotle says it was.
Right. Yeah. So, but Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, they don't care what Aristotle.
That's right.
You hadn't said it yet. They're doing it their way. And but now, as for the version of the story in Orestes, it seems like Euripides just made all this stuff up. Because sometimes the tragedians had a lot of freedom to pick any traditional version of the story that they knew, and there are different competing traditional versions of all the stories of the traditional characters of legend and mythology. But they could also make stuff up. I think that Euripides' contemporary Agathon was famous for not just making up a version of a story, but even making up the characters and completely inventing something, which is now, that's what all playwrights do. But for the Athenian tragic playwrights, usually you would take a traditional story that had to do with the Trojan War or the royal family of Thebes or whatever it is. But there was a lot of freedom to change things. Even Medea's murder of her children was probably Euripides' innovation, because there were other versions of the story of Medea, and his became the famous one in which she kills her children. But that wasn't the standard version of the story before Euripides wrote Medea.
Right, like her children died in some other way in other versions, right?
Yeah, the Corinthians killed them or something like that. Yeah, in the other versions, or all three tragedians wrote versions of the story of Philoctetes, and the one that survives is Sophocles. But Aeschylus and Euripides also wrote Philoctetes plays, and all three are different from each other in different ways. In Sophocles, for example, the thing that's exceptional about his is that he has Philoctetes living all by himself on the island of Lemnos, which is not a deserted island. They're supposed to be people there according to mythology, but Sophocles just said, well, I think this play would be most effective if Philoctetes is completely isolated and alone on this island. So the audiences were very flexible in what they would accept. They can't say, oh no, you can't say that it happened this way because we know that the real way is, so they were willing to, like the audience for Orestes, they knew the Oresteia that, had been a big hit. And they knew lots of stories about the house of Atreus and what happened, after when Agamemnon comes home from the Trojan War and all that. But anytime they went and sat down in the theater, they were looking forward to seeing how the playwright was going to tell the story this time, and they knew it could be different from other versions they had heard. So people wouldn't, I don't think, whatever else they thought about Euripides' Orestes, I don't think they thought, wait, no, it didn't happen that way. It happened the way it happened in Aeschylus. I think one thing that, now people did get kind of upset with Euripides for being innovative, but it had a lot to do with his music. There was a change in the style of music in the late 5th century, and it was called the New Music, or people now call it the New Music, and Euripides was right in the forefront of what we call the new music with innovation, and I think that, as I was saying before, one reason Orestes was so popular might be that people really liked the music. If a play is a hit, especially if it's a musical, there could be reasons that people liked it that are now lost to it. Like maybe the costumes were.
It's kind of like Broadway. Like there are some plays that we like not for the stories but for the songs.
Yeah, sure. And so I think Euripides was. I think that might have been, since this was such a really, really popular play, soon after Euripides' death, it might, maybe people just really loved the music, which was innovative, but, maybe people, but appealing. There's also when the chorus first comes on in Orestes, there's a dance, and again, if only we knew more about the dance and the choreography, because we know that they danced, but we don't have a lot of information about it. But they come in, as you remember, Orestes is sleeping, and Electra, his sister, is sort of fretting over him, because she knows he needs his sleep because he's been tormented by the Furies, and the chorus come in, and they're there to express their friendship and solidarity with Electra, but they're making noise, and so they come in and they say, "Okay, we're being really quiet. We're not going to wake Orestes up," and Electra keeps kind of scolding them and saying, "Keep it down, keep it down. You're making too much noise." And they say, "Okay, we're going to be really quiet," But you can tell that despite their best efforts, they keep getting louder and louder, and Electra keeps yelling at them that, trying to shush them. And
that would have been really interesting to see.
Yeah. So I think that would probably imagine the dance that would go along with the chorus like that, like, here we are, we're trying to be quiet, but we are also here to support our friend. And, they just kind of keep becoming more disruptive than they mean to be. And Electra keeps kind of swatting them back. So I think that, that would have been just a really interesting musical and dance number to watch. But all we have are the words of it.
So while the Oresteia slowly unfolds, and as we talked about before, it's well organized and it's the complete trilogy. I found that the ending of Orestes was abrupt. It has that, they call it a Deus Ex Machina ending, and it does seem like that. Apollo appears and apparently just resolves all of the difficulties. He declares that Helen has escaped and has become a goddess. Menelaus should remarry. Yeah. Pylades should marry Electra. Orestes should marry Hermione, and he's got like a sword up to her neck, right. And it's like...
This woman that you're holding a knife to her throat, that you're going to marry her. So,
and it was just like, that's it. Like all the we've tied everything into a little bow.
Yeah, and that's a lot of Euripides plays end with Deus Ex Machina, and it is something that Aristotle was critical of. He's when Aristotle says, well, the best kind of ending for a tragedy is not Deus Ex Machina, because you're just kind of cheating. You want things to work themselves out and not have some god step in and work it out. And then also Horace, the Roman poet, makes the same criticism. He says, "No, Deus Ex Machina, that's just the easy way out. You don't want to do that." But at the same time, this type of ending was really popular. I mean, Euripides used it a lot. And he was not, and Sophocles and Aeschylus also have gods appear, and so it doesn't seem. I think if we just take the plays on their own terms, it's hard to have any sense that Euripides himself thought of Deus Ex Machina as like the easy way out or a sort of cheap, cheesy way to end a tragedy. Because he was good and he knew what he was doing, and he used this type of ending over and over. And so I think it was, for the playwrights themselves, and also if the audiences thought that was a cheesy way to end a play, then those plays wouldn't have been popular, and yet they were. So Deus Ex Machina type endings didn't seem to bother the playwrights or the audiences of classical Athens. Just to kind of back up and explain Deus Ex Machina, it's the god from the machine. We use the Latin because Horace kind of popularized it. And the machine is the mechane, which was a crane that it was just part of the stage machinery in Athens, and someone could, if you want a character to be flying, they could fly on this device.
That makes sense.
So you'd have a god fly in on the machine, or sometimes literally it's not ex machina. Sometimes the god might just appear on the rooftop or something like that. But if you want them to fly, they could be on the crane, on the mechane. I think that Greek literature and Greek culture and Greek religion took the gods really seriously. So if a god shows up, it's important, So I think Apollo shows up at the end of this play. Athena shows up at the end of Ion. It's Medea, a chariot shows up to fly her out of there.
Right.
And I think that a god showing up at the end of a play is actually a serious, momentous moment. That momentous moment sounds kind of lame, but it's not just a cheap device. It's something really impressive. If a god is going to actually step in and get involved in something that's happening with people. So I don't think that the Athenians would have thought, oh, how come he brought Athena in? Why couldn't he just have people work things out on their own? Or at the end of Andromache, Thetis, the sea goddess, shows up and explains what's going to happen, and that doesn't seem disappointing. That seems amazing.
Right.
Wow, Thetis. So now Apollo's kind of a special case because he's he's the one, both in Aeschylus and in Euripides, Orestes. Apollo's the one who made Orestes kill his mother, who impelled him to do that. And that's a pretty terrible thing to do. And then, also in both plays, Orestes is tormented by the Furies because he killed his mother. That's a terrible thing.
That's what they're there for.
Yeah, and he was doing what a god told him to do. And Apollo doesn't seem to have his back very much. It's
I agree with you.
Let's see. Oh yeah, Orestes is talking to Menelaus shows up, and he's hoping that his uncle will kind of help him with this situation, and but he ends up not helping.
No.
But Menelaus says, "Well, has it helped at all, avenging your father?" And Orestes says, "Not yet. Apollo's going to help, but nothing. Apollo has, here I am, I'm about to be, and the other thing that's different in this play is Orestes and Electra are on trial for matricide because the people of Argos have decided that they're criminals and they're going to be sent to death. And so Orestes is already kind of bitter that Apollo got him into this situation and doesn't seem to be helping him at all. And then, he does show up at the end, but it's, there's something kind of,
that line of reasoning seems to work better in Aeschylus, in the Oresteia, the idea that a god prompted me to do this.
You mean it's more of a justification?
Yeah.
Orestes, or and also the idea, and in the Oresteia, you don't have this idea that Orestes he's being tormented by the Furies because that's what happens. If you kill your own mother, the Furies of your mother will pursue you. But then he goes through religious purification, and then there's the trial, and everything is worked out by civic institutions. And but here, he's just he's an accused criminal, and the people of Argos are gonna punish him for that. So it's different. But yeah, in both cases, Apollo is just, gets him into this, but can't really. Well, Apollo is the one who can purify him. But in this play, Apollo is really not helping much at all. He shows up at the end and says, "Okay, you're going to marry Hermione," but Apollo is kind of in several of Euripides' plays is not a very likable god. He's at the end of Andromache, the messenger comes to report how Neoptolemus has been killed by the Delphians, and the messenger says that describes the murder of Neoptolemus, and then he says, "The Lord of prophecy, who judges mortals according to the justice of their actions, did this to Achilles' son, who was making amends. The god held on to grudges like a mean and petty man. How then can he be wise?" So here's this character, the messenger, who's being openly critical of Apollo and saying Apollo's, just being petty and vindictive. And or in Ion, Apollo is actually, we only know him as a rapist. He's the one who. He's the father of Ion, and Ion has grown up as a servant of Apollo in Delphi, not knowing that Apollo is actually his father because he raped Ion's human mother. But he reveres Apollo, and then when this strange woman comes and tells a story of how, many years ago Apollo raped this Athenian woman, he's really shocked. That the god he's always has revered his whole life would do something like that. And he says, well, if all the gods, Zeus, Poseidon, Apollo, if they all had to pay restitution for their rapes, it would empty out the treasuries of all their temples. They should. So people in Euripides are often judgmental of gods, and the gods often don't come across very well. But it seems like especially Apollo. Even in Alcestis, Apollo is the benefactor of this guy Admetus. So to do him a favor, to show his gratitude to Admetus, he says, "My reward to you is that you won't have to die if you can get someone else to die for you." And
that's so very Game of Thrones.
Oh, okay, great. And then he asks his parents if they'll die for him, and that just makes them mad, rightly so. And then he gets his wife to die for him, but then he realizes that was a horrible mistake, So Apollo, but this is Apollo trying to be nice, but he gives, this favor, he bestows this gift on Admetus that actually just turns out very badly for him.
So let me ask you a question about about justice in Orestes. Orestes is set several days after the murder of Aegisthus and Clytemnestra, and the story tells us what Orestes and Electra are doing after the murder. In this play, Orestes' grandfather, and I don't want to mess this up, Tyndareus,
yeah,
says that Orestes shouldn't have killed his mother, but should have taken her to court instead and let judgment work itself out, let the judicial process work, put her on trial. But it's interesting, in the Oresteia, in the last play, in the Humanities, this murder, this violent act, was basically the impetus for the establishment of a justice system, a court system.
Right. Yeah.
There's no justice system when Orestes takes his revenge there. So you just have this pure moral dilemma. In Euripides' version, it seems like Orestes is more guilty. We don't feel as bad for him having to make that choice because in this case he could have let the justice system work. I don't know. Electra and Orestes just don't seem to be as noble in this play.
Yeah, they're not. They're
desperate. They're messy.
Yeah, they're not that likable, and Electra's really she seems sort of needlessly mean to Helen, and Yeah, and the legal system seems to already exist, whereas in the Oresteia it's like this is the reason that the murder court was established on the Areopagus, and now it's just Tyndareus says, why didn't you just why did you kill her? Why didn't you just sue her or something? So should we agree with Tyndareus?
Yeah.
That Orestes shouldn't have done it. Well, I guess, but what he's ignoring is that Orestes was provoked by Apollo.
I know, that's true. So let's talk about the Medea.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Should I say Medea or Medea?
Well, either, like, Medea is more like the Greek pronunciation, but everybody says Medea, so...
Okay.
I guess I always say Medea.
So, do you think that this is a personal question, just something that I was wondering if you would touch on. Do you think that, and I actually grew up watching Jason and the Argonauts, so at least a little...
The Harryhausen with the skeleton. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah. So I had, I guess, a cursory sense of who some of the characters were, even though Harryhausen wasn't going for accuracy. Do you think Jason's abandonment of his wife Medea has something to do with the fact that Medea is so utterly dependent on Jason? More so, I think, than... she's unusually dependent on Jason, given that she has to flee home. She kills her brother. She can't go back. She's cut off from her society. And in a way, her entire future is dependent on Jason. She can't return home to Colchis. In other words, because she betrayed her father and killed her brother, in a way, she is vulnerable. She's kind of psychologically vulnerable and physically vulnerable. Do you think that might have something to do with the way that things played out?
You mean, does that make Jason more guilty, or?
Is she an unusually vulnerable female character despite all her power? Another way of saying this is, what do you think of Medea?
Yeah, I think she is unusually vulnerable because she's been taken away from her home and also, burned her bridges because she killed her own brother. I mean, she's completely cut herself off from her family by, stealing from her father and killing her brother, and so she cannot go back to Colchis, which is also really, really far away. So she's in a completely foreign land, and she doesn't, she says to the women of Corinth, you have each other, you're part of the community here, but I'm just this weird foreigner who doesn't fit in.
Right.
And if that's why when Aegeus comes and she has that conversation with him and she realizes that he will welcome her in Athens, like that's what she needs to know to do what she's going to do, because now she knows that she does have a refuge. Otherwise it would just be, she'd be a complete exile. She would have no home and no one to take her in. But once she finds out that Aegeus will take her in, she does this terrible deed. But yeah, she is really vulnerable because she's pinned everything. She gave up everything for Jason, and she, committed a series of crimes and murders that, make her sort of unwelcome in other places.
And then she's betrayed.
Yeah.
So I wonder, I did want to ask you this too. I wonder, how are we supposed to take Medea as a character? How do we, as an audience, are we supposed to be sympathetic to her? Or are we supposed to just say it is what it is, sort of descriptively? Or are we supposed to be disgusted by her? I mean, she kills her brother, Jason's father, Glauce, Creon, the king of Corinth, and her own children. Like how?
Yeah, and of course, I think it's both. I mean, we are horrified by what she does because she kills her own children. That's an almost unimaginable thing. Who would do that? That puts the tragic in tragedy in our sense, and she kills Creon and Creon's daughter, and they didn't really do anything wrong. I mean, it's Jason that she has every reason to be mad at, and I think Euripides also makes Jason pretty hateable. He's a pretty bad guy. He's, first of all, what he does is terrible. She gives up everything to help him. He gladly accepts her help, but then he dismisses her and rejects her. And then when he talks to her, he's very condescending and unpleasant, and says, "Oh, you should be grateful that I took you out of that barbarian place in Greece, which is so much nicer," so it's easy to hate him. And this is another thing I think that Euripides does especially well, is that he can create characters who are just the worst, as Euripides says, who are just really horrible people, and and he can capture the sort of subtle ways in which they're just such jerks, and Jason is a good example of this kind of characterization. So there's not much to like with him, and so you can understand why Medea is so enraged at him. Also, in terms of he has committed serious crimes in terms of Greek culture and religion, because he's a betrayer of oaths. Medea calls on Zeus the enforcer of oaths, and so what he's done is he's not just a jerk, he's also an oath breaker, and the gods defend that kind of thing. And Medea is she's much more, she's very, she's likable, and she's smart, and we can admire also how good she is at manipulating people. And I don't know whether admire is the right word. There might be a question too, but everyone, the play is just a whole series of people come to her, and in turn she's able to manipulate each one to get what she wants from them. Like the chorus, they're the women of Corinth, and she gets them on her side by appealing to what it's like to be a woman,
right?
And they are on her side. She says, listen, do me a favor, don't say anything. If I come up with some kind of plan, help me keep my secrets. And then Creon shows up, and she kind of sweet talks him too. She says, because she's smart, she says, well, you know what it's like. You know what it's like to be smart. People don't like you. They don't trust you. It's rough being an intellectual surrounded by idiots. And Creon says, "Oh yeah,
who wouldn't eat that up?"
Yeah. So she appeals to him as a fellow intellectual, and she gets the one thing she needs from him, which is just one day to carry out her plan. Mm-hmm. And even Jason, then she finally kind of loses her cool and blows up at him, but she's able to manipulate him too. She always she knows how to push people's buttons and how to
yes, she does
get what she wants from them. And at the same time, she has a really legitimate grievance against Jason, and it's hard not to be on her side in this. In this play, and then that it makes what she does all the more horrifying.
So she's like a hero in a Quentin Tarantino film. This is like Kill Bill, there's a lot of murder and death, but we kind of get it in the end. We kind of understand the rage.
Yeah, although I don't
not her own kids though.
She's like Tarantino-ish because what she does comes from a very deep conviction inside her that her children are going to die, and if anyone's going to kill them, it has to be her. And also, so that's part of it. The other part of it is that's what will really, really hurt Jason the most, is to kill his children. Yeah. She wants to really, really hurt him. So there are both of these reasons. So I think I don't know. I guess I think of Tarantino characters as not quite having that kind of depth, that they're just acting in the interests of mayhem, and but Medea has really deep reasons for doing what she does.
Yeah, absolutely. So, in an introduction to one of your books, Robin Mitchell Boyask writes, in general, Euripidean scholars advocate one of two main positions. Either Euripides was an exponent of traditional Greek values and beliefs, or he was a radical who subjected all aspects of his society to a withering critique. Medea seems to offer ammunition for both sides of this split. Do the experiences of Medea expose the oppressiveness of patriarchal Greek culture, or do they affirm every negative Greek stereotype about women? The arguments are as endless as they are rich. So this brings to mind a question: which side of this fence do you come down upon?
Well, I think it's I don't know if it's a absolutely one side or the other type of fence. I think I think in the question of, was Euripides a traditionalist or an innovator, I think I'm more on the side of that he was a traditionalist in terms of the way he presents the gods. And I think there's not, sometimes there is sort of the stereotype of Aeschylus and Sophocles as the traditionalists, and Euripides as this wild ass innovator.
That's the stereotype I've heard.
Yeah, and I think that's pretty exaggerated, because a lot of things that people point to in Euripides as being so radical and modern and innovative are really, in their own way, very deeply traditional. So, and now in terms of was Medea, does she represent a critique of the patriarchy, or does she just show how horrible women are? That is an interesting question. I mean, definitely the critique of the patriarchy is there. I think that Euripides completely shows how difficult a position women are in. At the same time, he is. She's a dangerous woman.
She's a sorceress.
So if you say that this classical Athenian society has deep misgivings about women and thinks they're scary and dangerous, Medea is an example of that. I think that, Euripides, another way that Aristophanes made fun of him was by saying that all the women of Athens, in the play Women at the Thesmophoria, Euripides tries to infiltrate this women's festival because he's heard that all the women of Athens are just out for his blood, and that they're going to try to punish him in some way because he portrays women so negatively in his plays. And he's such a misogynist. But then it turns out that the women, once you get into this festival, the women are, 10 times worse than any misogynist's wildest dreams. They're just drunks and adulteresses and so. But I think the idea that Euripides is a misogynist, that women would be mad at him because the women he portrays are so evil, I think that's kind of silly too. I think Aristophanes is deliberately saying that to be funny, because Euripides' women characters have a lot of depth, and they're if I guess the other side of that argument is that Euripides is really a feminist because he shows such insight into women and he writes women characters so well.
There were some lines in Medea about, you went off to fight in the war and you're holding up civilization, but here I am giving birth.
Right, yeah.
Something like that.
I'd rather stand behind a shield 3 times than give birth once.
That's incredible.
And, and I think that's a good point. There's men think we have it so easy, but try going through childbirth. So and Euripides, in many ways, seems to. I mean, he's good at writing women characters, and women feature so prominently in his plays. He has a lot of the choruses more of his choruses are women, and a lot of his most sympathetic characters are women, like
Hecuba,
another one. And I think he was just someone who, of the 3 great tragic playwrights of Athens, I think he had so much insight into the way people act and the way they talk and the way they think. And I think that he gets inside the heads of his women characters as well as his male characters.
Yeah, I think so too. And in fact, before I even read any of Euripides, I had a discussion with a woman at a dinner party who was trying to convince the whole table that Euripides was a feminist, and she was telling us all about Medea, and I hadn't read it yet, so I was doing this. And
no spoilers.
Yeah, but I wanted to ask you one last question, and I just wanted to ask a little bit about Euripides' life. One of the things I read about him is that. And this is actually coming from the Encyclopedia Britannica, but I don't know how accurate this is that Euripides was not very successful in his life. He was only ever awarded 3 first prizes at City Dionysia, the article said, whereas Sophocles had won 24 victories, as many as 24 victories.
The numbers are different.
The numbers are different.
Yeah, because I think we know it was either 3 or 5 victories in his life, and we don't know what all of them were. And then he got a posthumous first prize for the trilogy that included the Bacchae.
I heard about that, yeah.
And we know that one of his first prizes was for Hippolytus. But not to cut you off, but compared to Sophocles, he was not a big first prize winner.
In the Encyclopedia Britannica, I'll quote them. It is often said that disappointment at his play's reception in Athens was one of the reasons for his leaving his native city in his old age. I wonder if that's true.
Well, yeah, I think that's a little bit now of a sort of old-fashioned take on Euripides' biography, and a lot of work that's been done since then. That for one thing, there's a lot more skepticism about ancient biographies than there used to be, and partly based on the work of Mary Lefkowitz, who wrote, she has written about how the ancient biographies are, you really just can't take them at face value. A lot of the stuff in them just comes from inferences made with no real basis on the author's own work. And supposedly Euripides left Athens late in his career and went to Macedon at the invitation of the king up there. But even that's been doubted too. We don't really know. Sadly, we don't know a lot of biographical things for sure about the poets, and we know that we have these traditions, but we know that a lot of that stuff is probably made up. But in terms of him being sort of a loser compared to Sophocles, that's not really an accurate way of looking at it either. Actually, to quote Robin Mitchell Boyask again, or to refer to him, he does a good job in the introduction of sort of debunking that point of view, because it's like, I mean, the dramatic festivals were a big deal for Athens. You know, they were a really important festival. They had really big audiences. The city really threw a lot of resources at putting on these festivals. But for each festival, only 3 tragic playwrights got to compete. It was called getting a chorus. So you had to, just to be in the festival in the first place, you had to be one of only 3 who made it to that level. And there were lots of tragic playwrights in Athens. So I think Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides were the 3 who consistently would be granted a chorus and given the opportunity to put on a play. So even if you don't come in first, it's like saying, "Oh man, I went to the Olympics and all I got was a bronze medal."
Yeah.
You know, it was a pretty big deal just to be in the festival in the first place. And it's true that Sophocles won a lot more, but on the other hand, even the judging itself had a little bit of a random element, because the judges would vote, but they would put their votes in an urn, but then not all of the votes would be counted. It was sort of randomized that way. So maybe it was like a sampling error, or maybe it might have been slightly luck of the draw that Euripides didn't win as often. I mean, and maybe Sophocles was more of a judge's favorite, but audiences still liked Euripides. I mean, certainly the opinions, the popularity after their death, Euripides wins that contest. And then, as I was saying earlier, by the time you get to the 20th century, he's sort of lost again. But I think maybe he's pulling ahead once more. But he was definitely a very popular playwright with a lot of success. So the idea that he left Athens in disappointment, that doesn't really make sense, because he was, active and producing and consistently, getting picked to be in the festival.
Thank you so much for being on the program. We really appreciate it, and thanks a lot.
Well, it was my pleasure. I love talking about Euripides, and thanks for being such a great interviewer.
Thank you for your time.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
All right, a fantastic interview there. So I'd like to introduce a new segment to listeners. This segment will really be a series that I expect will probably span the next 4 or 5 episodes of this podcast. This segment represents an effort on my part to put together a practical guide for students and also parents to some of the schools in the United States that have what you might call a great books curriculum, or at least a liberal arts tradition that's strongly rooted in the Western literary tradition. I think the evidence shows that many of our once great colleges are now failing our students. Students, at least in the United States, are mortgaging their futures for a substandard product. Today, in the U.S., we expect every single young person to go to college, even young people who have no interest in college and no interest in learning. We want every single young person in the U.S. to take out a big loan that they'll be paying off well into their 50s, pick a major, shell out the big bucks, and devote years of their lives to living in these adult sleepover camps. Now, all of this can be worth it for some students, but not all students. Americans owe over $1.5 trillion in student loan debt, spread out among about 44 million borrowers. That is $620 billion more than the total U.S. credit card debt owed. In fact, the average student loan debt for class of 2017 graduates was $40,000, and this was up 6% from the previous year. And most certainly will go up this year as well. And if the loans you've taken out are unsubsidized loans, that debt begins accruing interest immediately. If they're subsidized, which is a better way to go, that means that the government pays the interest until you graduate. But regardless, many students aren't able to pay this debt back. Right now, the student loan delinquency rate is at something like 12% or more. And so students are putting all of their faith, all of their money, all of their parents' money into these institutions of higher learning. And these institutions are failing us. Now, I want to make this perfectly clear at the outset. I know that college graduates on average make more money than those students who only possess a high school diploma. I know that. And so that is evidence that the marketplace and employers still want to hire college graduates. A college degree has a real value in an increasingly competitive labor market. And so I do think that good students, high-achieving students, students with curiosity and talent and drive and passion and ambition and an innovative spirit should still go to university. I do think that. That shouldn't render universities immune from criticism. College has never been more expensive. In fact, the universal availability of student loans is one of the biggest factors driving up the cost of college. Before the growth of the college loan industry, colleges used to have to keep their costs down. In 1980, a year of college cost just over $3,000. Today, the average cost is around $25,000. And this spike in cost is a direct result of government, with its seemingly unlimited supply of cash throwing endless amounts of money at these universities, who in turn have no reason to keep their costs down. You see, government subsidies drive up demand for college education because students have more money to spend, even if it's money they'll never be able to pay back. These universities know that students basically have unlimited funds. I would know. I was recently a student, and on day one of school, the government offered me $22,000 based on my financial status. I accepted, clicked a box to e-sign, and the money was in my account minus the tuition that it paid 2 days later. So it's really easy to raise the cost of fees and tuitions at these colleges, and they do raise the costs every year beyond the rate of inflation. And of course, the subsidies that the government offers increases demand for college, which in turn leads to academic credential inflation. Today's master's degree is yesterday's bachelor's degree, and so on. The other thing skyrocketing the cost of education is the expansion of university administration. For example, take the University of Michigan. I just read an article about this. The University of Michigan currently employs a diversity staff of nearly 100 full-time diversity administrators. More than one quarter, quote, 26 of them earn annual salaries of more than $100,000, and the total payroll for this small army is $8.4 million, unquote. Here's another quote from the article. According to Department of Education data, administrative positions at colleges and universities grew by 60% between 1993 and 2009, which Bloomberg reported was 10 times the rate of growth of tenured faculty positions. Even more strikingly, an analysis by a professor at California Polytechnic Institute at Pomona found that while the total number of full-time faculty members in the CSU system grew from 11,614 to 12,019 between 1975 and 2008, the total number of administrators grew from 3,800 to 12,183, and that is a 221% increase. Just to be clear, I use UMichigan as an example, but this is happening at most of the large schools, public and private, the schools that they call R1 institutions. And so beyond the safe spaces and the trigger warnings and all of the microaggression talk, the bias response teams, the deplatforming of any speaker to the right of Bernie Sanders, the cordoned off free speech zones, and all of this, beyond this culture of coddling and censorship in which these universities have to pay $600,000 to bring someone like Ben Shapiro, a mainstream conservative speaker, to campus, beyond all that, you now have these armies of diversity bureaucrats running around with quotas, race baiting, putting up posters telling kids how to speak, think, act, and dress, telling them which Halloween costumes they can wear and which art exhibits microaggress which groups, creating segregated safe spaces for the students. Now, I don't like any of this, but all of this can still be worth it if you're like my wife or my brother who choose to major in a field like engineering or math or nursing or computer science or business, or if you're someone who goes into law or medicine. the hard sciences and the various professional programs, for the most part, are still worth doing. These disciplines are not politicized the way that humanities disciplines are, and they still have a strong grounding in facts, practical methods, best practices. But for a student who is passionate about English literature, say, or anthropology, and this is really advice for parents at this point, I would really recommend some deep, careful thought and consideration. The social sciences and humanities have become, and it pains me to say this, they've become a bit corrupt. That is, many schools and many entire disciplines within the academy, mainly those disciplines that are part of what we call the humanities, as well as several of the social sciences, have lost sight of their original mission. And their original mission should be to teach students to read well, to write well, to speak well, and to become adept at solving complex problems. As the 1,800-member nonpartisan academic group Heterodox Academy puts it, quote, "Many American universities are typified by an ideological monoculture. But this is wrong. Universities are supposed to be places where debate can happen, where heterodoxy reigns, and where culture can be transmitted. And when I say culture, I mean what Matthew Arnold defined as the, quote, best that has been thought and known in the world," unquote. Jordan Peterson, the former Harvard professor, now University of Toronto professor and best-selling author, recently defined this problem at the Aspen Ideas Festival in Colorado. Here's a clip.
You recently said that what universities have done is beyond forgiveness. I wonder if you can explain what you mean by that?
Well, they're overwhelmingly administratively top-heavy. And they don't spend any more money on the faculty than they did 30 years ago. And the cost of that administrative top-heaviness, which is well documented, not by me, by other people, and it's been that way, it's been accelerating over the last 20 years, has been a radical increase in tuition fees, especially compared to the radical decrease in price of most things over the last 20 years. Now, so they've become administratively top-heavy. The way, and this is especially true in the United States, the way that's been managed is that unsuspecting students are given free access to student loans that will cripple them through their 30s and their 40s. And the universities are enticing them to extend their carefree adolescence for a 4-year period at the cost of mortgaging their future earnings in a deal that does not allow for escape through bankruptcy. So it's essentially a form of indentured servitude. There's no excuse whatsoever for that. It means the administrators have learned how to pick the future pockets of their students. And because they also view them in some sense as sacred cash cows and fragile, let's say, because you might wonder why the students are being treated like they're so fragile. It's like, well, we don't want them to drop out now, do we? And we can't, if they drop out, then we don't get our hands on their future earnings in a way that they can't escape from. And that cripples the economy because the students come out overladen with debt that they'll never pay off right at the time when they should be at the peak of their ability to take entrepreneurial risks. So they can't do that because they're too crippled by debt. And so that's absolutely appalling. They're gerrymandering the accreditation processes so that the degree no longer has its credible value. They're enabling the activist disciplines, which have zero academic credibility whatsoever in my estimation, and I'm perfectly willing to defend that claim. And by enabling the activist disciplines, they're allowing for the distribution of this absolutely nonsensical view that Western society is fundamentally a patriarchal tyranny, which is absurd on at least 5 dimensions of analysis, but is becoming increasingly the thing you have to believe if you're allowed to speak in public. Well, that's what else? That's a good start. They're not teaching students to read critically. They're not introducing them to great literature. They're not teaching them to write. It's like the list goes on and on and on.
Do you think in a way that you are a symbol of higher education's failure? Meaning the reason maybe that people are showing up, 5,000 people to listen to you, it's going to be 20,000 in London in July, is because there aren't that many people who unironically are talking about what it is to live a good life and asking questions about how to live a meaningful one. If you would say that in most universities, I feel that you would be laughed out of the room.
Well, it would depend on how you said it and to who, but if you say it to students, then they're so happy to listen to you that they can hardly stand it. Because even the most cynical students come to university hoping that there's something there worth learning. And the reason that they're exposed to great literature, for example, because there is such a thing, it's not all power claims, is because great literature contains the key to wisdom, and you need wisdom in order to live without undue suffering.
And of course, I agree with everything Jordan's saying here, but instead, universities are teaching students that the great ideas of history are, quote, white ideas, and that what matters in life, what is substantive about life, and this is what universities are telling our students, what matters in life springs forth from a person's identity, from their race, their class, their gender. When my wife was getting her PhD at Cornell, I went to a party with her. My wife is a scientist, but at this party there were 3 young women. They were English majors. And of course, when I found out that they were English majors I could talk to at a party full of scientists, I flocked to these women and they had all come together. And so I asked the first woman on my left, "So what do you study?" And she said, "I study race, class, gender, and disability in Victorian literature." The second one says, "I study race, class, gender, sexuality, and trauma in 20th century American literature." And the third one says, "I study race, class, gender, sexuality, and colonialism in contemporary world literature." And so that's pretty much how it works now. In the humanities and social sciences, instead of taking students through the great conversation of history, instead of introducing students to the thinkers, thoughts, ideas, and documents that have shaped history in a balanced way, professors are teaching students that the West is fundamentally corrupt, that all truth is subjective and relative. They're teaching students that one's permission to speak about certain topics and to make claims about complex phenomena is dependent upon their identity, not upon the facts on the ground, but upon the person making the claim's identity. Liberal arts professors are teaching students that they live in an oppressive patriarchy, and that some vague, shadowy institutional discrimination is lurking around every corner, even if no proof is offered. And they're being taught, students are being taught, that the fundamental thing to focus on in the study of literature or ideas is the author's race, class, gender, and or sexuality. And additionally, what are the politics that emerge out of that book? If a classic story contains instances of misogyny, like Updike's work sometimes do, they must be erased from the canon. If the story contains offensive language or racist characters, that happens in life. Racism happens in life. It's awful, but it happens, like Mark Twain's Huckleberry Finn does. It must not be read. Right? If a work features women characters who aren't brave, muscular, intractable, proud, man-eating characters like Xena Warrior Princess, and if the equitable distribution of those characters doesn't live up to our standards of equity and representation, well, we have to change the curriculum. And so the focus has increasingly become not about substance. The focus is not on substance. It is not on aesthetics. It isn't even on truth. It isn't on the ideas. The focus instead is on social justice and feelings and inclusion and equity. Equity means now, has come to mean equality of outcome. And this stuff is leaking out into the larger world beyond academia. And many of these schools, and I know this because I have a degree both in philosophy and a degree in English. At many of these schools, a student can get a degree in English without having to take a course that focuses on grammar or the history and structure of the English language. At some of these universities, students do not have to take a course on Shakespeare or medieval literature. And so these students get their degrees, they do an education program that lasts 13 months, and suddenly they're teaching your kids. And this is what's happening, and it's becoming more and more apparent and blatant. Case in point, I was recently at an AP literature training, a week-long AP Summer Institute session. And I tell you, I was literally the only person at this thing who believes that teaching the Western classics is a worthy endeavor. There were probably 20 teachers at this session, and not a single one of them, besides myself, believed that there was an inherent value in teaching and defending the Western literary canon at all. I mean, not even partially. Complaints that I heard while I was there were, it's exclusive. It's made up of dead white males. It's hard. It's hard for our kids. They can't read it. It's oppressive. Many of the books, and I'm not making this up, one woman at the training said, many of these books contain micro-invalidations. I have no idea what that is, but apparently our literature contains instances of micro-invalidation. There aren't enough black books and Hispanic books, one teacher said while I was there. I don't know what a Hispanic book is, so I asked, I said, what's a black book? What's a Hispanic book? She had no answer. At one point, we were instructed to read Their Eyes Were Watching God. Their Eyes Were Watching God is a brilliant book by the African-American author Zora Neale Hurston. Brilliant book. Just a terrific, terrific book. That book, in fact, is in the Western canon, right? If you actually go and read Harold Bloom's The Western Canon, you'll see at the end of the book, Harold Bloom makes a list of what he thinks are the great works that belong in the canon. Their Eyes Were Watching God is a 20th century canonical work. So we were assigned to read this book, Their Eyes Were Watching God, and I brought up Richard Wright's famously negative, scathing review of Their Eyes Were Watching God, and I said, hey, I mean, if you're going to read this book, the teacher had asked us, what are some suggestions? What would you add to the curriculum? How would you teach this? And I said, hey, if you're going to read this book to your students, you should also read this review by Richard Wright. And then I explained how much I disagreed with Richard Wright's assessment of the book. Richard Wright basically argued that Hurston's language stereotypes black people. It contains the stereotypical sensual language used to describe black people and so on. And Richard Wright, argued essentially that Hurston's work was too universal. And that a book like Their Eyes Were Watching God should be more overtly political and should work to advocate for specifically black progress, etc., etc. And now, what I told the class was that I think that students should read this essay because it can start a really important conversation and it can get students discussing what is the telos of a great work of literature, what is the value of great literature. Now, I should say, right at the outset, I think Richard Wright is a brilliant, genius writer. I think his books, Black Boy and Native Son, are standard 20th century Western canonical works. But I disagree strenuously with his take on Their Eyes Were Watching God. Their Eyes Were Watching God is an aesthetic masterpiece. It's brilliant because of, not in spite of, its universality. It tells a compelling, powerful story written in masterful prose. There is rich, figurative language and symbolism, well-developed characters, etc. So I took issue with Richard Wright's negative review of Their Eyes Were Watching God. And what was the response? What was the response from the class when I told them that I personally disagreed with Richard Wright's review, but that I thought it would be worth teaching? I was told by a woman sitting a few seats away from me that who was I to make claims about such an issue? Richard Wright believes what he believes for reasons that someone of my background could never understand. How could I make claims about Richard Wright's review? Now, I publicly disagreed with the woman and basically said that identity politics breaks us into tribes, and do we really want to live in a society in which I can't make claims about a certain literature because of the color of my skin? Does this advance us? And how does my critique of the literature depend on the color of my skin? I mean, that makes no sense. Either my argument is valid, reasonable, sound, evidence-based, and in line with the facts, or it isn't. But the fact of the matter doesn't depend on my identity. It's like, so here's a good test, actually, to determine whether or not you're arguing in good faith, or whether your argument is rooted in an ad hominem form of attack, or whether it's rooted in claims of identity politics. Take what I said back at that AP training. According to the woman I mentioned, my critique of Richard Wright is wrong, ignorant, invalid, ill-formed. Okay, now maybe it is. But now replace me with an African-American man. Let's say that instead of me, a white guy sitting there, Let's say that there was an African American man sitting there who made the very same utterance. Just replace us and have the African American man make the claim I made. Would that suddenly make the claim previously stated correct, true, valid, acceptable in this case? If when he says it, it's true, and when I say it, it's false, that's when you know that you've made a logical error. It's an ad hominem appeal, and it's a mistake rooted in the politics of tribe and identity. Now, I bring this example up. Well, I bring it up, one, because I was just at the training less than a week ago, but also because this view is mainstream, and it dominates the academy. One of the striking notions that I learned from attending this training was an odd double standard that seemed to be almost universally accepted among the teachers at this training, and I want to share this with you. This came up about 15 times, and nobody questioned it. In fact, I didn't even question it, because it is taboo to question it. And here's the double standard. I noticed that when the class talked about all white populations, and we did an exercise in which the teacher, the AP instructor, went around and asked the racial makeup of each of our populations and recommended books to use in our instruction based upon the race of our students. When the subject for discussion was the all-white population, we were told that we should use a multicultural curriculum. In an all-white suburban school, students, we were told, should read a spectrum of books by multicultural authors. They should read books by African American authors, by Asian authors, by Indian authors, by Native American authors, by gay authors, by trans authors, by Caribbean authors, etc. Because look, these white kids need to get outside of themselves, experience the world, learn from other cultures, experience some humility, learn from the other, learn from the marginalized outsiders, see how others live. Literature is about learning from those who are different than you. And I actually happen to agree with this sentiment. But what I think she meant was different in all of the ways that matter, like skin color and sexuality, but those aren't the things that matter. But here's the double standard. When the class talked about Hispanic, Latino, Black, Native American students, on the other hand, when the teacher came to someone who actually did have a population of Hispanic students, say, for example, the important thing in that case was to pick a curriculum filled with authors who look like them, right? If you have a diverse population, if your population is largely Black students, if your population is largely Hispanic students, in that case, for some reason, this was never explained to me, you have to choose authors whose works feature characters who share the identities of those students, right? If you have a population of Hispanic students, you need to choose books about other Hispanic people. Students need to see themselves in the text. Otherwise, they won't be able to get into the literature. So white people have to read about other people, which I would agree, that's actually a great idea. We should read literature from diverse authors. We should experience what it's like to be in another person's shoes. That's great. But when we're talking about diverse students, people of color, they have to read literature that matches their own race. But see, this is a terrible way of looking at a student. This notion treats white students as pale, bland, colorless, self-absorbed oppressors who need to come down from their high place and empathize with the oppressed other to get a richer and fuller sense of the world. And it treats people of color, conversely, as mere exemplars of their race, class, and gender. And the only way we can get through to them is by appealing to these immutable surface characteristics from which we believe their identity and their mind and their soul and their spirit and their personality springs. So people of color, by this view, are mere avatars of their race, their sexuality, their gender. That's who they are. And they won't read the literature if it isn't about someone else, written by someone else who shares a group membership with them. But white people, those pesky suburban white kids, they need to experience otherness. And they are perfectly capable of identifying with others and getting enjoyment from a work of literature, even if the characters are different than them. Okay, so I'm getting a little off track here, but my overall point is that this is what students are being taught. These are the ideas that teachers have as they enter the field of education. These are the things that our AP trainers are teaching incoming teachers. This is what is taught in many of the corrupt disciplines that make up our humanities departments. And I'll be honest, and I'll list the disciplines that I would argue this applies to, because this is a guide for students and parents. I'll list the fields that I feel like are oriented by and grounded in what you might call identity politics and a kind of postmodern neo-Marxism that looks at civilization, that looks at Western civ, that sees the marketplace of ideas as a Hobbesian battleground between competing identity groups warring for power and influence. Everything in these disciplines that I'm going to list, everything is socially constructed. Reason is a tool of the patriarchy, trade is exploitative, women are oppressed, etc. And these disciplines that I do not recommend my students enter, these disciplines are English, comparative literature, sociology, education, increasingly anthropology, and pretty much any major that ends in the word studies, and that would include women's and gender studies and the various ethnic studies majors. And it's not like you need to take my word on this. Simply go to the website of the nearest major university and visit the website of, say, the Gender Studies Department, and simply read what they do. You'll see that invariably all of the professors are on the hard left, and the disciplines are activism-oriented. They're activism-centered. The point is to teach you what to think, rather than how to think. For example, I live in Amherst, Massachusetts. My wife went to UMass Amherst for engineering, and so I visited the Gender Studies Department website at UMass Amherst. I'll read the opening description. Here's what they say they study. Here's what they say that if you attend their gender studies program, here's what they say you'll learn. And this is a quote from the website. The Women, Gender, Sexuality Studies program at UMass Amherst offers a robust interdisciplinary set of options, including an undergraduate major, an undergraduate minor, and a graduate certificate in advanced feminist studies. We are committed to interdisciplinary and intersectional analysis, in which the study of women and gender is multifaceted, diverse, and embedded in a network of power relations, including race, class, sexuality, and nation. The field views and analyzes intellectual problems and issues of current concern through the perspectives of gender, class, race, ethnicity, nationality, sexuality, and ability. Students think in this program about challenges faced by marginalized, or not, individuals in both domestic and foreign spaces, and work to conceptualize solutions that can be applied in communities around the world. Core courses for the major explore new methodologies in feminist scholarship and study critical race feminisms, transnational feminisms, and sexuality studies. I can't even read that. So here's the question. Do you think I'd be welcome in any of those classes? Do you think that you would be welcome in any of those classes? Or maybe you think that I'm being unfair. Maybe you think that gender studies is too much of an extreme example. It's not like very many students major in the gender and ethnic studies disciplines. How about English? What do students who study at UMass Amherst, I hate to pick on UMass, but I live a mile away from UMass and I have a deep personal connection to that school, and I think it's a good example of just your run-of-the-mill, large, modern, public R1 institution, and it's fairly reflective of general trends, I would say. Let's visit their site and look at the work that their fine graduate students are doing. What does the research focus on? So I visited the website, and their English department, like most English departments, lists the titles of their graduate students' dissertations. And I'm just going to read through some of these dissertation titles on the list, and that'll give you a sense of what the scholars there research, what the teachers teach about, what kind of research the students do. Okay, I'm going to list some of these titles. And these are the dissertations that students spend years working on. So I'll list these in order. The most recent go first. Sex and Difference in the Jewish American Family. Incest Narratives in 1990s Literary and Pop Culture. Quisqueyanas Valientes en este Espacio, I can't even read that, Dominican Women Writers in the Spaces of Contemporary American Literature. Wow, that one wasn't even in English. Civic Domesticity, Rhetoric, Women, and Space at Hull House. Here's another one. The Blackness of Blackness, Meta-Black Identity in the 20th and 21st Century African American Culture. Okay, here's the next one. Waiting for Now, Post-Colonial Fiction and Colonial Time. Latina Identities, Critical Literacies and Academic Achievement in Community College. Demanding Spaces, 1970s U.S. women's novels as sites of struggle. Theaters of War, Performing Queer Nationalism in Modernist Narratives. Enduring Affective Rhetorics, Transnational Feminist Action in Digital Spaces. Sustainable Public Intellectualism, The Rhetorics of Student Scientist Activists. Homosexuality is a Poem, How Gay Poets Remodeled the Lyric Community and Homosexuality is a Poem, How Gay Poets Remodeled the Lyric Community and the Ideology of Sex to Theorize a Gay Poetic. Affecting Manhood, Masculinity, Effeminacy, and the fop figure in Early Modern English Drama. Here's the next one. Our Story Has Not Been Told in Any Moment. Radical Black Feminist Theater from the Old Left to Black Power. Writing for Social Action, Affect, Activism, and the Composition Classroom. A multidirectional memory approach to representation of colonization, racism, and genocide in literature. The Guerrilla Tongue, The Politics of Resistance in Puerto Rican Poetry. And here's the last one. Technologies of Racial Formation, Asian American Identities. Asian American Online Identities. Okay, so that was actually difficult to get through. My point is that so much of this stuff discourages intelligent mainstream students from entering fields like English and sociology and education and psychology. Do you know anyone who really and truly deeply loves reading that would be interested in any of that stuff? The politicization of these fields can really work to discourage and alienate students who are truly passionate about reading and learning and knowledge. And I would argue that the regressive, illiberal atmosphere that is being created at some of these places is also pushing students away. It's keeping students out of the humanities. And what you have is a great big polarization. You have a giant divide. Moderate and conservative students stay away from the humanities because their ideas, their worldview is not accepted. And not only is it not accepted, it's maligned as being evil and racist. And so there's a single narrow dogma, a monoculture, an ideological homogeneity dominating the humanities right now. And the humanities are being overrun by radicals. A friend recently shared an article with me from the Wall Street Journal that I'll admit was hard to read. The article is titled, White Informed Civility is the Latest Target in the Campus Wars, and it's by Stephen Salerno, and I'll read a little segment of it. This is pretty astonishing stuff. And this is a quote from Salerno's article in the Wall Street Journal. From the land that irony forgot, which earlier gave us microaggressions and trigger warnings, comes a new and surprising movement, this time to combat civility. Civility, you see, is a manifestation of the white patriarchy. Spearheading this campaign are a duo of University of Northern Iowa professors who assert that civility within higher education is racialized rather than universal norm. Their article in the Howard Journal of Communications describes a need to stamp out what they call whiteness-informed civility, or WIC. The pervasiveness of WIC, it seems, erases racial identity and reinforces white racial power. Who in the world knows what that means? I'll go back to the article. Their thesis can be a tad hard to follow, unfolding as it does in that dense argot for which academia is universally beloved, but their core contention is twofold. One, that civility as currently practiced in America is a white construct. Okay, so now if you're civil to someone, that's white supremacy now. Two, in a campus setting, the woke white students' endeavor to avoid microaggressions against black peers is itself a microaggression. So even when you don't microaggress people, you're microaggressing people. And I'll go back to the article. A form of noblesse oblige, where white students are in fact patronizing students of color when they don't microaggress them. Not only that, but by treating black students with common courtesy and expecting the same in return, white students allied black grievances, bypassing the race talk that is supposed to occur in preamble to all other conversations. Got it? So the article then goes on to talk about how this stuff is leaking into other fields and endeavors, how this new trend is changing the norms of classroom discussions at a lot of these colleges, and how it's actually now seeping into the field of competitive debate, the college debate teams and such. Salerno writes, quote, and I'm almost done here. Finally, there's a recognition in the academic space that the way argument has been taken place Finally, there's a recognition in the academic space that the way argument has taken place in the past privileges certain types of people over others. Joe Leeson Schatz, director of speech and debate at Binghamton University, told The Atlantic, "Arguments don't necessarily have to be backed up by professors or written papers. They can come from lived experience." Classroom protocols are under attack as well, the article continues. A primer titled Diversity and Inclusiveness in the Classroom, produced under the auspices of the University of Arizona, asserts that classroom debate, quote, must be an accessible space, and that sharing should be based on one's own feelings, experiences, and perceptions. Students are pointedly discouraged from rebutting feelings that don't jibe with verifiable reality. Should someone slip up by introducing a challenging fact, however, the text has a prescription. If a student feels hurt or offended, the hurt student can say, ouch. So there you have it, folks. If anything I say offends you, if the facts I discuss or the literature I read doesn't jibe with your feelings, experiences, and perceptions, just say ouch, and I'll be sure to issue a formal mea culpa apology during our next episode. Okay. So stepping back from all of this, and I'm sure we could go on all day about the politicization of the humanities and social sciences, all of this I bring up as a preface in order to introduce a new segment in this podcast. This segment will be called A Guide to Great Books Colleges, and again, the segment represents an effort on my part to put together a practical guide for students and parents to some of the schools in the United States that have what you might call a great books curriculum, or at least a liberal arts tradition that is strongly rooted in the Western canon. Because it does pain me to recommend to my students that they shouldn't major in English, because despite my earlier rant about the failure of colleges to transmit wisdom and provide value for students, at the end of the day, do I think that certain students who have a real passion for the humanities and social sciences disciplines that are less obviously practical, which often don't put students directly on a track to a professional career and which on average sometimes don't lead to high-paying jobs, do I think that some students are suited for these disciplines, the wisdom disciplines? Absolutely. I still think that students should go into the wisdom disciplines. Many students can thrive in these disciplines and develop viable, rewarding futures in this way. But it's become increasingly clear that this side of the educational landscape, the humanities and social sciences side of things, has failed to provide the kind of value that parents and students deserve. And yet, there is hope. There are many good schools out there that are still committed to debate and the rigorous examination of ideas and philosophies, schools that still do expose students to the great conversation of history, schools that have high expectations and high standards, schools that are dedicated to transmitting wisdom, dedicated to teaching students how to read well, write well, and think well, schools that are dedicated to developing in students the ability to think critically and to take intellectual discourse seriously, schools dedicated to pursuing and discovering the good, the beautiful, and the true, who introduce young minds not to the latest intellectual fads, but whose orientation is geared towards inculcating in students that collection of qualities that Cicero called humanitas, which includes the cultivation of judgment, taste, and civic virtue. That's what college should be about. So I'd like to kick off this segment by introducing listeners to the first schools that made the cut. I'll say right off the bat that I haven't ranked these schools, nor have I placed them in any particular order, but each episode for the next 3 or 4 episodes, I'll talk in depth about several schools that still offer students the classical liberal arts experience, schools who in explicit name, or at least in spirit, still offer what you might call a great books education. Now, when the series has finally come to an end, what I'll do is I'll splice all of these segments together and create out of them one long guide for parents and students who wish to send their children to a great books college. And the first school to make the list is the University of Chicago. So the University of Chicago, the great books education has been a cornerstone of the liberal arts and humanities programs at the University of Chicago. Early great books proponents like Robert Maynard Hutchins, Mortimer Adler, and Alan Bloom all taught at the University of Chicago and helped to promote the importance of a great books education. In fact, during his first term at the University of Chicago in 1931, Mortimer Adler teamed up with then-President Robert Maynard Hutchins to teach a 2-year general honors course modeled on the Great Books program at Columbia University, launched by John Erskine. So while the University of Chicago doesn't have a core Great Books program a la Adler, Bloom, and Hutchins that students must take, the spirit of the Western Canon is still very much alive at U Chicago. But one of the primary reasons to celebrate the University of Chicago is the institution's long-standing commitment to fostering freedom of expression and freedom of speech. Recently, Jay Ellison, the Dean of Students at the University of Chicago, he issued a statement basically responding to this atmosphere of safety culture, of safe spaces, of trigger warnings. The Dean of Students came out and said, quote, "Members of our community are encouraged to speak, write, listen, challenge, and learn without fear of censorship. You will find," and he was in this letter, he was speaking to the incoming freshmen and their parents, "you will find that we expect members of our community to be engaged in rigorous debate, discussion, and even disagreement. At times, this may challenge you and even cause discomfort." And he adds that Chicago's, quote, "commitment to academic freedom means that we do not support so-called trigger warnings, we do not cancel invited speakers because their topics might prove controversial, and we do not condone the creation of intellectual safe spaces where individuals can retreat from ideas and perspectives that are at odds with their own." And he said all of this with the full support and approval of the university's president, Robert Zimmer. But the great thing about the University of Chicago's commitment to free speech and open debate is that all of this is actually codified in the university's Report on the Commission of Freedom of Expression. This is a famous document. It's really a statement of principles that other schools can adopt if they want to, and have adopted, in fact. And I'll read a few excerpts from the report. The report begins, I quote, "In 1902, in his address, President William Rainey Harper declared that the principle of complete freedom of speech on all subjects has from the beginning been regarded as a fundamental in the University of Chicago, and that this principle can neither now nor at any future time be called into question. 30 years later, a student organization invited William Z. Foster, the Communist Party's candidate for president, to lecture on campus. Even back then, in 1932, this triggered a storm of protest from critics both on and off campus. To those who condemned the university for allowing the event, President Robert M. Hutchins responded that our students should have freedom to discuss any problem that presents itself. He insisted that the cure for ideas we oppose lies through open discussion rather than through inhibition. On a later occasion, Hutchins added that free inquiry is indispensable to the good life, that universities exist for the sake of such inquiry, and that without it they cease to be universities. Because the university is committed to free and open inquiry in all matters, it guarantees, and I'm still reading here from the Report on the Committee of Freedom of Expression, because the university is committed to free and open inquiries in all matters, it guarantees all members of the university community the broadest possible latitude to speak, write, listen, challenge, and learn. The University of Chicago fully respects and supports the freedom of all members of the university community to discuss any problem that presents itself. Of course, the ideas of different members of the university community will often and quite naturally conflict, but it is not the proper role of the university to attempt to shield individuals from ideas and opinions they find unwelcome, disagreeable, or even deeply offensive. Concerns about civility and mutual respect can never be used as a justification for closing off discussion of ideas, however offensive or disagreeable those ideas may be to some members of our community. The university may restrict expression that violates the law, that falsely defames a specific individual, that constitutes a genuine threat of harassment, that unjustifiably invades substantial privacy or confidentiality interests, or that is otherwise directly incompatible with the functioning of the university. In addition, the university may reasonably regulate the time, place, and manner of expression to ensure that it doesn't disrupt the ordinary activities of the university. But these are narrow exceptions to the general principle of freedom of expression, and it is vitally important that these exceptions never be used in a manner that is inconsistent with the university's commitment to a completely free and open discussion of ideas. And the report ends on this. In a word, the university's fundamental commitment is to the principle that debate or deliberation may not be suppressed because the ideas put forth are thought by some or even by most members of the community to be offensive, unwise, immoral, or wrong-headed. It is for the individual members of the community, not the university as an institution, to make those judgments for themselves, and to act on those judgments not by seeking to suppress speech, but by openly and vigorously contesting the ideas that they oppose. So good stuff here, and at this point I'd like to share a short clip from the half-hour Heterodoxy podcast, put out, of course, by Heterodox Academy, and this clip features Heather Hying. Heather Hying is a former professor at Evergreen State College. Heather recently settled with Evergreen State College, and she was essentially pushed out along with her husband Brett Weinstein after the college melted down last year and became something of an Orwellian nightmare. And she's become something of a public intellectual at this point because of that whole incident. She calls herself the professor in exile, and here she's praising the University of Chicago and its commitment to free expression and academic excellence.
There's a trend now that's fashionable to accede to student demands and to add admin in diversity and equity, and to create safe spaces, and to create student centers representing various demographics, LGBTQ and students of color and Native students, and on and on and on. And that's pretty much everywhere at this point. And certainly it's what we saw happen with extraordinary rapidity at Evergreen under the leadership of the new president, starting, I guess now it's 3 years ago. Any college, and the shining example of this would be University of Chicago, that does the opposite and that says, you know what, we actually stand for Enlightenment values. We are seeking truth. We are going to maximize the search for truth. And in so doing, we will find other values, but that is our top value. Rather than proclaiming that we are, for instance, as Evergreen has and as other schools have, and as Jonathan Haidt has identified this as a sort of a binary choice that many schools are making, you can do a search for truth or a quest for social justice, but you cannot simultaneously maximize both. The vast majority of schools out there are doing the latter, are proclaiming, are advertising to their potential students and to their current students and enforcing on their current faculty and staff and advertising to future faculty and staff. We are about social justice. And that comes at a high, high cost. And I know anecdotally, and I also know not anecdotally, that students are turning away. That at Evergreen, many students effectively looked at that and said, not for me. That does not sound, and here I'm putting words into most people's mouths, although I've heard these words from a few people, that doesn't sound like an education to me. So in that climate, if you act like University of Chicago and you say, we actually, we have a creed. We are going to seek truth, and we are not going to let anyone disrupt another individual's right to speak. You may protest, but if that protest ends up being disruptive such that you disable another student or faculty, whatever, but another student's right to hear or ability to hear what someone else is saying, that is not okay. And so if you made that like an opening salvo, a motto, if you would, of the university, and said, come check us out if this looks appealing to you. And if it doesn't, by all means, don't come here. But we're going to hold you to it. And if you end up thinking that it's your right to disrupt other students' rights to hear ideas that you find uncomfortable once you're here, you are going to be asked to leave, and you will leave. I think that if every university did that, there would be little economic advantage in being first, but there would still be great advantage intellectually in any university that did that. But especially right now, when so few schools are doing that, when so many schools are doing the fashionable thing and hiring more and more admin and staffing more and more offices in so-called equity and inclusion, any school that did the opposite, I think, would actually not just be supporting intellectual inquiry, but also end up winning economically because they'd get more students applying.
That's fantastic. And if you don't know Heather's story, I'll post some links to the website. Just visit www.westerncanonpodcast.com and you can check that out. Okay, up next is St. Olaf College in Northfield, Minnesota. St. Olaf College is a private liberal arts college of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America. The school was founded by Norwegian immigrants. I actually had a professor who attended this college and who could speak Norwegian. St. Olaf offers students a fantastic Great Books program that I want to talk about called The Great Conversation. This is actually a major at the school, and I'm going to read the description that they've provided. The site says, quote, "The Great Conversation is a sequence of 5 courses that introduces the major epochs of Western civilization to students via great works of human achievement. Beginning with the study of the ancient Greeks and Hebrews, this program traces the evolution of literacy and artistic expression, philosophic thought, religious belief, and the sciences of human behavior into the modern world. Students who complete the program bring a broad grounding in most of the liberal arts to their majors, to other courses, and to their study of other cultures. Students in the program are not passive recipients of information about their intellectual heritage. Rather, they respond to great works in an interdisciplinary way, challenging the ideas expressed in the works and challenging their own ideas as well, thus joining in the great conversation of men and women throughout the ages about perennial issues of human life." And so I should say here at this school, even those students who don't major in the Great Conversation, all students must take a series of 5 courses that vary in focus and scope, from Western Civ and the foundational ideals of America to Asian studies and environmental education courses. Not to mention, each year St. Olaf puts on a world-renowned Christmas festival, so that's something to consider as well. The site brags, quote, "Great Conversation students encounter great works of art. They read epics, plays, paintings, and novels, and philosophical, political, and religious documents. They become acquainted with works from Genesis to the Origin of Species, created by artists from Homer to Picasso. The Great Conversation is a program for those who like to read, discuss, and write about ideas. It is for those who believe that learning about the past is profoundly relevant to understanding the present, for those who want to examine the Western tradition in a unified way. And it is for those who believe that an education ought to cultivate discriminating minds, inquisitive spirits, and moral sensitivity." Wow. Sign me up for that. Okay, and the third and final school I'd like to review this month has the honor of being the first school in our nation's history who refused to discriminate on the basis of race, gender, or ethnicity. That's an amazing feat. And that school is Hillsdale College in Michigan. Founded in 1844 by Christian missionaries, Hillsdale College is both notorious in many ways and selectively rigorous. Hillsdale is a traditional liberal arts college, and perhaps more than any other school that made my list, it is the one most fervently dedicated to preserving and defending the Adler, Hutchins, Bloom, Erskine, Barzoon, Socratic-style great books education. Another distinctive feature of Hillsdale College is that the school is unabashedly and unapologetically conservative in its orientation. What makes Hillsdale different? The school website says, quote, "We believe that the study of the past provides a valuable window into the future. A Hillsdale education, however, is more than just the study of what is good, true, and beautiful. It is in the practice of these things that our education comes to life." In fact, the school is so distinctive and bold in its educational orientation that the New York Times recently did a profile of the school that I want to share with you listeners. The profile offers a surprisingly positive take on the school, given that it's the New York Times and Hillsdale is a conservative school. And I'd like to read the bulk of it here on this podcast. This article, too, will be posted on the website under the tab labeled Links. New York Times writer Eric Ekholm, who visited the school, writes, quote, "At first, Hillsdale College seems to resemble dozens of other liberal arts schools with rich histories. There are statues of Washington and Lincoln, Jefferson and Churchill, and a monument to students who fought for the Union. A point of pride at a college that was founded by abolitionists, visited by the crusading former slave Frederick Douglass, and open to black students and women from its very founding in 1844. Cross the quad on what is known as the Liberty Walk, though, and you will encounter something different. Statues of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan?" In a letter to prospective donors, Hillsdale's president Larry P. Arnn said that 2017 promises a beginning to restore limited government. Hillsdale, a private college of 1,400 students in southern Michigan that describes itself as non-sectarian Christian and is dedicated to civil and religious liberty, is scarcely known in many circles. But among erudite conservatives, think progeny of William F. Buckley Jr., it is considered a hidden gem. What they admire is the college's concentration on the Western philosophical and literary canon, sometimes disparaged as the great books of dead white men, and its reverent treatment of the American founding documents as the political culmination of that tradition, a tradition that scholars at Hillsdale say has been desecrated by a century of governmental overreach, including the New Deal and Obamacare. And again, this is from a New York Times article by Eric Ekholm. Now I'll read on. "It is no coincidence that Justice Clarence Thomas, an advocate of strict originalist interpretation of the Constitution, delivered the commencement address last spring, likening Hillsdale to a shining city on a hill for its devotion to, quote, liberty as an antecedent of government, not a benefit from government. Conservatives are also entranced by Hillsdale's decision to forego any federal or state funds so as to be unfettered by government mandates. In 1984, in Grove City College versus Bell, the Supreme Court ruled that even Pell Grants for needy students or GI Bill money for veterans subjects a college to federal regulations, and so Hillsdale students are not allowed to accept such funds. Most receive institutional grants. As a result, the college does not follow Title IX guidelines on sex discrimination and the handling of sexual assault cases, and it has refused to engage in the otherwise required reporting on student race and ethnicity, let alone develop an affirmative action plan. George Will, the conservative columnist, praised both the college's independence and its curriculum, saying that, quote, by stressing the great books and Western civilization, Hillsdale has become a niche success. He added, I think it's greatly regrettable that it's only a niche. The soul of Hillsdale is its core curriculum, which largely occupies students for their first 2 years. It includes more than a dozen mandatory survey courses on topics like the Western heritage, with readings from Hammurabi to Hobbes, and American heritage, the Mayflower Compact to inaugural addresses by Franklin Delano Roosevelt and Reagan. Students also study core principles of biology, chemistry, and physics, and take the trademark class on the American Constitution. Beyond admiring the stress on traditional rigor and methods, conservatives more widely venerate the great books approached in a certain way. They laud the reading of original texts, gleaning internal ideas of right and wrong, rather than dwelling on the less noble historical contexts. In principle, studying great books is not inherently conservative, said Molly Worthen, an assistant professor of history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, who laments that this ground has been largely ceded by liberals. There is a tradition that grew out of ancient Greece and Rome that is shared by modern progressives, she said. But the study of the great books has become entwined with a certain set of methodological assumptions and political or ideological goals. Still, in several classes that I observed, writes the journalist Eric Ekholm, the teachers encouraged spirited debates and broached topics far beyond conservative dogma. Dr. Whalen, for example, an English professor as well as provost, ended his course, Great Books in Continental Literature, with a look at Samuel Beckett's Endgame. What happens if there is no meaning there, but you have an absurd need to express meaning? He asked of Beckett's vision. One student drew a comparison to the music of John Cage, which he had studied in another class. Hillsdale teachings describe the Constitution as a timeless document whose principles have been compromised by the creep of welfare and regulation. If one subject captures the juxtaposition of Hillsdale's path-breaking origins with its present-day conservatism, it is race. From the official catalog, quote, "The college values the merit of each unique individual rather than succumbing to the dehumanizing, discriminatory trend of so-called social justice and multicultural diversity. To me," Dr. Larry Arnn said, quote, "I think it is an urgent thing for the college to help those who are disadvantaged." He cited the charter school initiative as a response that fits Hillsdale's values. Hillsdale has received private grants to foster K-12 schools funded with public money that introduce children to the ancient Greeks and constitutional principles and require the study of Latin. Hillsdale serves as a consultant without payment, again avoiding government funds, providing local organizers a curriculum and teacher training. So far, it is aiding 16 schools, 3 of them, 1 in Georgia and 2 in Texas, serving mainly minority populations, Dr. Arnn said. And here's a quote from Dr. Arnn from the article. "We, quote, hope that a lot of those students will come here," he said. In the meantime, Hillsdale defiantly claims an exemplary record of opposition to racial discrimination. As if to drive home the point, the college is adding 1 more bronze to its Liberty Walk this spring, a statue of Frederick Douglass. Okay, so that's where the article ends. And what I found interesting about Hillsdale in doing a bit of research is that the school has a huge endowment. I think it's over $1 billion at this point. And this is one of the reasons that Hillsdale is able to forgo federal funding of any kind. The Hillsdale College website boasts that, quote, "Hillsdale's cost is significantly less than that of other nationally ranked private liberal arts colleges. We're proud to be considered a great value. We also know that college remains a significant investment for most families. In fact, almost all of our students receive some form of aid, including scholarships, grants, loans, and student employment. The average aid package awarded in 2015 was $16,700, with $14,300 in gift aid." And here's a clip from the Hillsdale College website that gives you a better sense of their mission in fostering a great books education.
How do we measure good? Is it defined by the majority? Is it measured by self-satisfaction or personal fulfillment?
The good of anything is found in its ability to accomplish what it was created for. To realize its purpose for existence, as intended by its maker.
Only in this realization can something truly be called good. We were created for a purpose.
Our purpose is not left to chance or whim,
but was determined by our Maker
and written in our nature.
Our purpose is to seek truth,
in order to discover and to act on what is good and beautiful in this life.
So that's Hillsdale College, and that is the last school we'll be talking about in this episode. This segment, our guide to great books colleges, again, will be an ongoing segment that we'll do here on the Western Canon Podcast until we run out of schools to profile. Next month, we'll take a look at 3 more great books colleges. So before we wrap up the show, I'd like to announce another new segment that will be running on the show, and this segment will likely be how we'll wrap up the show each month. This segment will be called the Liberty Lounge. The Liberty Lounge will be a book review of sorts. On an ongoing basis, I'll be reading books that focus on the principles of liberty and freedom. I'm going to start next episode with a book by Thomas G. West called The Political Theory of the American Founding. And what I'll probably do with that book is break it down into 2 parts and analyze the book over the course of 2 episodes. The next book after that will likely be Jonah Goldberg's The Suicide of the West. We'll do older texts like John Stuart Mill's On Liberty, and we'll also do newer texts like Steven Pinker's Enlightenment Now. And that will yield for us both a broad and diverse conversation about liberty, freedom, and justice as we examine on this podcast the great ideas of the Western world. Well, that's it for this episode, episode 7 of the Western Canon Podcast. Stay tuned for next episode, episode 8, which will feature the guest Yaron Brook. Dr. Brook is the author of several books. He's a prolific public speaker, and he's the director of the Ayn Rand Institute. We'll be talking next episode about Aristotle, the Western Canon, his book Equal is Unfair, and his recent discussion with Jordan Peterson. In our next episode, we'll also be taking a look at Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, and that will round out our set of episodes on Greek tragedy. As always, visit our website, www.westerncanonpodcast.com, for more information, or to access older episodes and interviews. Feel free also to donate to our Patreon account so that we can keep the lights on here. Closing out here, I'd like to give a special thank you to Diane Arnson Svarlien and Gina Santiago. Once again, I'm Jordan Alexander Hill. Thanks for listening, and happy reading.